Kim kicks back in his massive palace, having a leisurely Sunday, drinking and munching on a plate of fine Swiss cheese. He's visited a number of military production facilities earlier in the week, so he's earned himself some rest and relaxation, watching some Jackie Chan movies while he waits for the next VOD of that Chicago Bulls game he's been looking forward to. It's a beautiful day in the DPRK, and despite it being his day off, Kim has kindly allowed us to document a day in his extraordinary life. Here we have it, folks. A look behind the curtain at the hermit kingdom of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and its supreme leader, the one and only Kim Jong-un. Thank you for joining us today, O glorious leader. We will see the opulence and luxury that only a royal like Kim could afford. The ruler of North Korea has some pretty expensive tastes, not unlike his father. While it's not quite known precisely how much cash the big cheese of the DPRK has on hand, he has certainly got enough to splash out on luxury goods. In 2012, the year Kim Jong-un assumed power as the supreme leader, the annual spending on luxury goods leaped from the equivalent of $300 million to over $645 million. Talk about being a baller, right? Hey, keep the cameras over here, folks, just like we practiced. Keep all eyes on the supreme leader only if you want to keep your freedom. Did I say keep your freedom? You just imagined that. Moving on, from a massive presidential palace in Pyongyang to private islands, a luxury super yacht, sports cars gifted by Vladimir Putin himself, and of course a private jet, Kim Jong-un's got it all. Although he has 17 palaces to choose from and his own private island, Kim frequently resides at his Rongsong residence, a fully furnished palace with a 1,000-seat capacity movie theater on site, perfect for kicking back at the end of a hard day. You're probably wondering what movies North Korea's supreme leader likes to watch. Well, Kim Jong-un is reportedly a big fan of the Godzilla movies. Isn't that just wild? This appreciation for kaiju cinema runs in the family. His father, Kim Jong-il, was such a lover of Godzilla that he kidnapped the legendary South Korean film director Shin Sang-ok and his wife, and then forced them to help him make the greatest North Korean kaiju movie of all time, 1985's Pulgasari. Yes, that is actually true. The Kim family really goes the extra mile to keep their people happy and entertained. Hold on, what are you saying? Massive wealth disparity between the elites class and the citizens of North Korea? You better watch your mouth behind that camera. Just keep looking at all the cool things Kim Jong-un owns. The supreme leader's expensive tastes even extend to his diet, with plenty of pricey food imported to the DPRK from all around the world. We're talking about the highest quality pork from Denmark, steaks of Kobe beef from Japan, Chinese melon, caviar from Iran, and even a ton of Brazilian coffee. The supreme leader needs all the caffeine he can get, and only the very best will suffice. He spent well over $920,000 on coffee alone in 2016. Add to that a further $95,000 on German wine, and even $33,000 on pricey American spirits like Hennessy, which can run up to over $2,000 for the top-shelf bottles. Now that sure sounds like a party. What do you mean by what do the rest of the people in North Korea eat? Well, they get their rations, which have been short lately. Actually, the supreme leader had to slash those back in 2019. There are food shortages, you see. Why doesn't he stop spending so much on expensive food in restaurants for the wealthy elites then? Look, buddy, maybe you should just stop asking questions altogether, okay? You know what? I think we're done here. Let's pack it up. Thanks for your time and… Okay, listen. We all know you know this is all just PR. Kim Jong-un indeed enjoys an opulent life in the lap of luxury, while the ordinary citizens of North Korea struggle to make ends meet. While the wealthier elites enjoy fancy restaurants and all the finer things in life, everyday people in the DPRK are given meager food rations and constantly have to worry about famine and disease, all while also being forced to live under the brutal authoritarian rule of their supreme leader, who imposes frightening limits on their human rights, barring them from moving freely around the country and even preventing them from leaving North Korea altogether. With such an insane degree of poverty and inequality between the social classes, you're probably here searching for the answers to a few big questions. 1. How does Kim Jong-un pull it off? He's constantly portrayed and described as a wild, unpredictable man who could fly off the handle at any moment and launch one or multiple of his nuclear arsenal in a fit of rage. And that leads us to question 2. Just why is it that North Korea is constantly threatening to start a nuclear war? And lately, Kim's threats of nuclear reprisal have felt a little less like empty saber-rattling. He's even labeled the Republic of Korea, the DPRK's U.S. allied neighbor, as the primary enemy of his hermit kingdom. He's even ordered the destruction of a monument to the concept of unification. making it seem that under Kim's rule, the only hope of Korean reunification is Kim unifying it as one massive pile of irradiated ashes. But here's the thing. In a post-nuclear annihilation world, there isn't going to be any Chicago Bulls games or any Wagyu beef or any of Kim's beloved bottles of imported Hennessy. So, what's his endgame here? Surely if Kim Jong-un has managed to accumulate more wealth than the citizens of his entire country will ever see, even a fraction of it, then wouldn't he want to protect that lavish lifestyle of his? Let's start by clarifying. Yes, Kim Jong-un is absolutely a dangerous dictator who, as well as being responsible for brutally abusing the human rights of his own people, poses a genuine threat to the world at large. So for all his bluster, there's a lot of weight behind his numerous warmongering threats, and rightly a cause for concern each time he aggressively orders the DPRK's military to be on standby for nuclear strikes. North Korea is one of the most militarized countries in the entire world, with its military upheld as one of the most important societal institutions for tackling economic and political problems. The outward aggression displayed by Kim Jong-un through his military is additionally backed up by the country's advances in nuclear weapons and missile capabilities. In 2006, 2009, 2013, twice in 2016, and in the following year, 2017, North Korea tested 6 nuclear devices. Back in 2009, when the 6-party nuclear talks held between the United States, North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, and Russia eventually broke down, North Korea saw to it that the facilities that produced the fissile material used in their nuclear weapons restarted production. According to intelligence gathered by the US, North Korea has even developed a miniaturized nuclear warhead that is small enough to be mounted on long-range ballistic missiles. As of 2023, North Korea intensified its nuclear weapons testing compared to the previous year. In addition to testing ballistic and cruise missiles, they've also conducted trials of hypersonic missiles. These missiles can fly at low altitudes, making them difficult to detect on radar. In April 2023, they even tested the Hwasong-18, which is claimed to be their most potent missile, which utilizes solid fuel, enabling faster launch compared to those powered by liquid fuel. On its initial test flight, the Hwasong reportedly flew 1,000 kilometers, but is said to have a range of around 15 times that. The second test in July 2023 sent another Hwasong missile soaring to over 6,600 kilometers in 74 minutes. Much like earlier iterations of the missile, the Hwasong-18 could easily cover enough distance to reach the continental US. And with meetings between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, there were widespread growing concerns that North Korea would soon be seeking even more advanced weapons technology from Russia. Needless to say, Kim Jong-un has the proverbial nuclear-powered bite to back up his bark. But what's interesting is that he's not actually the mad dog that some people seem to think he is. Although he's definitely eccentric, he's far from an erratic and irrational megalomaniac. As a dictator, he's a lot more shrewd, cunning, and above all, rational regarding his decisions. And this even applies when he's firing off threats of military action. It's all part of solidifying himself as not just a credible threat on the world stage, but as the rightful, powerful, supreme leader of his country. To understand exactly why Kim Jong-un is so quick to make military threats, we need to first hop back in time to when his dad, Kim Jong-il, was running the show. For decades beforehand, North Korea was an isolated country propped up by the Soviet Union to act as a barrier preventing the capitalistic ideals of the Western world from making their way into Northeast Asia. However, when the Soviet Union eventually dissolved, all of the financial backing they provided to North Korea suddenly dried up. Without subsidies, the country fell into an economic catastrophe that was so bad that it claimed the lives of 1/10 of their population, who starved to death thanks to an extreme famine that would become known as the Arduous March, which we honestly think is probably putting it quite lightly. The country was on the brink of collapse during the 90s, not just thanks to the economic situation. The famine had managed to undermine a key part of North Korea's official state ideology at the time, one that placed massive restrictions on the information available to its citizens. North Korea taught its people to believe without question that they lived in a place of freedom and prosperity, and the lack of contrary information entering the country from the outside made it easier to believe this. But then the Arduous March hit, and all of a sudden North Korean citizens were starving, which certainly made it a lot harder to believe the state's propaganda was unquestionably true. As a further result of the ongoing famine, North Korea was forced to ease its border with China so that food could enter the country and be sold on the black markets. And when books and videos from outside North Korea were inevitably smuggled in alongside the food, citizens were offered a glimpse at the outside world beyond the borders. Another way in which the loss of the Soviet Union's support threatened the very existence of North Korea was that the country no longer had a large superpower to protect it from the wider world. The Western influence, especially the reach of the United States across the globe, was seen as a direct threat to Kim Jong-il and his regime, and was even openly hostile toward North Korea. So, to solve these problems that threatened to undermine his rule over the country, Kim Jong-il devised a policy to convince the people living under him that the famine and the economic struggles were all actually for the benefit of North Korea. It was referred to as the Songun policy, or military first policy. North Koreans were told that the reason for their ongoing hunger and poverty wasn't because their country wasn't as prosperous as the state's propaganda had told them. Instead, Kim Jong-il claimed the reason he kept his citizens impoverished was that it was necessary to fund North Korea's military to protect them from internal and external threats. The line was that imperialist Americans were on the cusp of invading North Korea and would do unspeakable things if they were able to overwhelm Kim Jong-il's regime. So, the Songun policy used the poverty of ordinary North Koreans to rally them behind the regime, rather than making them resent it for letting them starve. The famine was reframed as a necessary loss of life to let the North Korean army keep the Americans from taking over. Of course, to maintain any lie, you need to keep up appearances. And if we're talking a lie on that scale, you have to go pretty big to prevent the seeds of doubt from spreading. What better way to keep people believing in the need for military might than by continually making bold proclamations of war, so that you can be seen by the people boldly lashing out against your enemies? In a sense, a lot of Kim Jong-un's threats of war is a trick he learned from his old dad as a way of putting on a show for the North Korean people, as much as a way for him to keep the rest of the world on edge. Threats like that keep one of the country's biggest lies going, the idea that they're constantly on the verge of all-out war with America and need all the military power and nuclear weapons they can get their hands on. Speaking of nuclear weapons, that's part of the reason for the various nuclear tests North Korea has conducted over the years. That was primarily how Kim Jong-il kept the policy of Songun fresh in everyone's mind. It's a family tradition that his son has kept on going. Of course, it's far from the only reason for North Korea's ongoing nuclear testing. Songun and portraying the country as biting back against their enemies is only one part of why Kim Jong-un is always threatening war. Another reason is that it's a way to push back against the sanctions placed on them by other countries. Naturally, other countries aren't just watching North Korea and hoping that their threats of war are just for show. In fact, the United Nations has historically actively tried to push back against all those worrying missile tests. Of course, when faced with sanctions from the UN, Kim Jong-un often responds with more provocations, like preparing his troops for nuclear attacks. But that's not because he desires to go to war with his enemies. For one, wars are expensive, which means waving off his luxury lifestyle and focusing all his efforts on commanding his forces. However, if a war actually breaks out, Kim Jong-un knows he might not stand much of a chance of winning. Despite being such a heavily militarized country, Kim Jong-un is well aware of how his soldiers, their weapons, and their training compare to that of other armies around the world. Of course he's aware of it. It's how he's able to use that same fear-mongering that his dad did to keep the Songun policy alive. So why all the bluster and provocation of war if he doesn't think he can win? Well, it makes it seem like there's a risk of war. Much like a child throwing a temper tantrum, the shouting and over-the-top declarations made by the DPRK's supreme leader aren't an indicator that those end times are upon us, but more that he wants to get his way and then acts out when he doesn't. This creates a pretty big problem though, whether intentional or not. The problem isn't that North Korea is likely to unintentionally kick off a nuclear war, but that these outbursts could raise the risk of an unwanted conflict. No matter how many of them are empty, a threat on this scale is still a threat and a major cause for concern. For example, when North Korea conducts missile tests, nobody expects South Korea to be in imminent danger, but it still raises a lot of worried eyebrows. And Kim Jong-un is fully aware of how sensitive to this potential danger his enemies are. In order to keep him appeased, South Korea and the US have offered concessions to North Korea in the past as a way to prevent these provocations from escalating into a full-blown conflict. It's done in an effort to quell future outbursts, but oddly incentivizes Kim Jong-un to keep occasionally poking the bear to see what kind of reaction he can get and if it'll provide him with a favorable outcome. As recently as 2024, Kim Jong-un declared that North Korea had no intentions of avoiding war with South Korea and considered them to be his country's principal enemy. He also told his people that they should prepare for a war with the United States But a lot of this comes down to him wanting to apply pressure to the alliance between South Korea and the US, in the hopes that he could eventually undermine it. His actions are purely born of trying to keep himself in power and keep his regime alive by diverting the attention of the North Korean people toward countries he's identified as hostile enemies and away from the many failings of the regime, so that he can seem like a powerful and successful leader, without actually addressing the many issues faced by the people living under his regime, such as the disparity of wealth and the violations of human rights he's subjected his citizens to. It's not hard to see just how threatened Kim Jong-un feels his position of supreme leader is, since it's even a crime in North Korea to speak in any negative way about the regime, the government, Kim himself, or his family. And not the kind of crime that earns you a slap on the wrist and a harsh warning. It's the kind of crime that's punished by death. It's not just his citizens that Kim Jong-un wants to take him seriously either, as provocations also play well among the high-ranking military officials and the politicians of North Korea's wealthy elites, who have also greatly benefited from the regime. These people have considerably more experience than him, some of whom even served under his father, Kim Jong-il, before he died. So how do you keep everyone in line and ensure none of your generals launch a coup against you? You make yourself look like you're just as tough as dear old dad. It's like a North Korean version of Succession if all the Roy children also had access to the nuclear codes, which might give you an idea of just how dangerous this situation is. To his credit, Kim Jong-un didn't waste any time establishing himself as the big dog when he first assumed power. When taking over from Kim Jong-il early in 2012, he enacted one of the most violent political purges in North Korea's history. A number of high-level officials were executed under the guise of treacherous actions, but more likely because Kim Jong-un didn't want any of them undermining him. He even went as far as to have one killed with an anti-aircraft gun. Clearing out the house is one good way to establish yourself as the toughest guy in the yard. The second is to keep people thinking exactly that, and that's where his various aggressive military provocations come in. Developing and testing nuclear weapons sends a pretty clear message to Kim Jong-un's highest-ranking generals and officials. The supreme leader means business. Threatening other countries? Well, he's got to be hardcore if he's going to do that, right? Playing into the internal politics of North Korea itself, Kim Jong-un uses his loud, bold declarations in the direction of war to prove to those around him that he's a capable leader, rallying not just the citizens of the DPRK, but its higher-ranking officials around him, further encouraging them to back him no matter what, and also because he'd have them and their families killed or sent to a forced labor camp for daring to defy or so much as even question his reckless actions. However, while trying to appeal to the rest of North Korea's wealthy elites with his war provocations, Kim Jong-un has to balance that with not endangering his relations with his allies. Primarily, his two biggest backers are Russia and China. Despite their often oppositional stance against the West, and the United States in particular, neither of these countries is eager for Kim Jong-un to hit the big red button, despite being his allies. China is still one of North Korea's most important international partners, accounting for almost 90% of its foreign trade. While China clearly has expansionist plans for Asia, with Taiwan being first on the menu whenever Beijing sees fit to strike, the CCP has no interest in ruling over a pile of irradiated rubble. The result is Kim speaking out of both sides of his mouth, simultaneously playing the stable economic partner for China while wearing the crown of a mad nuclear-powered king willing to blow it all up before losing power. Astute foreign policy nerds are probably thinking, this is a dangerous gamble. Kim Jong-un is essentially betting the state of the world on maintaining his kingdom and ridiculously lavish lifestyle. And you would be correct. If Kim overplays his hand and ends up needing to put his money where his mouth is, Kim won't be the only one going down. We might all be heading into a fiery radioactive grave with him. With sanctions and harsh rhetoric seeming to do little to dissuade Kim's reckless behavior, it's become an open question among the NATO members and its Indo-Pacific partners as to how the alliance should deal with the escalation. Ri Jong-ho and David Maxwell of the National Interest suggested that physical action needs to be taken to illustrate that nuclear weapons are not a win condition for anyone involved, but especially the DPRK, or the escalations may eventually reach an irrevocable peak. Maxwell and Ho put forward a limited attack similar to the Israeli targeted bombing of Syria in 2007. For those experiencing foggy recollection on that, on March 30, 2007, an intelligence report was published stating, quote, Syria has set up within its territory a nuclear reactor for the production of plutonium through North Korea, which, according to an initial worst-case assessment, is liable to be activated in approximately another year. A concerning development, though one that isn't as advanced as the situation in North Korea right now, given that the DPRK is already confirmed to have functioning nuclear-armed ICBMs. However, given Syria's position as a proxy for Iran in the wider Middle Eastern conflict, also involving Israel and the United States, as well as their assortment of allies and enemies in the region, developing a nuclear reactor, which could have led to the development of nuclear weaponry, was seen as an untenable move, and Israel chose to respond. On September 6th of that same year, Israel dispatched 4 F-16 fighter jets to the heart of Syria to strike at the partially completed Al-Kibar nuclear reactor facility situated near Deir ez-Zor. During this 4-hour operation, the facility was allegedly damaged beyond repair, crippling Syria's developing dreams of nuclearization. Could a similar display of targeted force put a dent in Kim's constant threats of war? Perhaps, but it's a hawkish gamble, with a potential high reward tempered by a catastrophically high risk. To fully understand Kim Jong-un's mindset and willingness to tout his last resort as his first line of action, you also need to understand the historical context of being a dictator. It's a career path that can give you some lavish luxuries while you're alive, but in the end, they rarely go out peacefully. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator from World War II, was executed by partisans along with his wife after the collapse of his fascist regime, after which their corpses were dragged through the streets. Nicolae Ceausescu ruled Romania with an iron fist from 1965 to 1989, until a revolt saw him and his family put up against a firing wall and summarily executed. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was hanged outside Baghdad when he lost his power in 2006, and less than a decade later, Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi was attacked by an angry mob, who brutalized and murdered him on video for the crimes he committed against the Libyan people. And these are just a handful of the dictators who died from the wrath of their own populace after they lost their institutional power. It's a tale as old as time, and stories like these widely contribute to the extreme paranoia of dictators who are still in power. One of Kim's nominal allies, Vladimir Putin, was reportedly haunted by the footage of Gaddafi being killed. He saw a potentially dark future for himself at the hands of the Russian people. Many foreign policy pundits pointed to this moment in 2011 as a point of marked escalation in the Russian leader's distrust of everyone around him. It isn't hard to extrapolate this same feeling to Kim Jong-un. Even in the event of a Korean unification, it seems unlikely that the United States will be eager to just give Kim a second chance after years of humanitarian atrocities and rampant threats of nuclear war. Regime change isn't just a threat to Kim Jong-un's lifestyle, it's a threat to his very life itself. And faced with that existential threat, it makes sense from the perspective of a legendarily selfish dictator to constantly remind the world that he's wearing a nuclear dead man switch. If the Kim dynasty goes down, so does the human race. That's the true purpose of Kim's military posturing. It's also why it's healthy to have some skepticism about the merits of a targeted strike. Syria's Bashar al-Assad is no sweetheart. In fact, he shares Kim's penchant for quelling rebellion with the most brutal means necessary against his own people, including rampant torture and the infamous use of chemical weapons. But he is to some extent a rational actor, and a less self-interested proxy of Iran than the DPRK is to China. But back in 2007, while there was a non-zero chance of military reprisals for the Israeli reactor attack from Syria and Iran, neither were nuclear states. If Kim read a tactical strike like that as a precursor to a wider invasion or more direct attacks against himself, we might all end up getting a first-hand look at how unpleasant it is to be affected by nuclear fallout. Another potential solution posited for this incredibly precarious situation is the use of psychological and information warfare. While we discussed earlier how Kim's threats of war are a way to gain favor with the North Korean elites and his high-ranking military figures, those figures still exist under Kim's thumb and may privately be expressing concern that Kim's nuclear saber-rattling could land them all in the same global apocalypse. But these views would have to be expressed very, very privately. As we mentioned earlier, Kim loves a good political purge. High-ranking party members and even members of his own family are not exempt from brutal assassination or execution when he gets the sense that they're turning against him. If Kim likes you, you can live in the lap of luxury, but really it's a gilded cage. Because as soon as he gets tired of you, you and your entire family are off to be worked to death at a forced labor camp. That likely results in certain resentments that North Korea's enemies are eager to take advantage of. The information war route involves destabilizing the Hermit Kingdom from within using the clever application of knowledge. giving the general populace access to information about and media from the wider world, which may break the cult of personality and carefully curated propaganda that the Kim dynasty has spent decades enforcing. And if you doubt that this would be effective, then it does beg the question of why consuming outside media is liable to get you executed if you're caught. But it may be more effective to turn those psyop tactics to the very elites and high-ranking officials that surround Kim, the people who may slip into the power vacuum he creates upon his deposition or death. Working from within to destabilize the upper echelons of the regime may turn Kim's aggression inwards, at the very least taking some of his focus off threatening nuclear Armageddon for the rest of the world. And in a potential best-case scenario, Kim could potentially be deposed from within and replaced by a figure who is potentially more sympathetic to Western interests, or at the very least is a little less liberal with the terrifying nuke threats. Of course, some voices in the national security space are taking a more moderate approach to the apparent escalations of North Korean activities and rhetoric. Commentator Sidney Seiler from the Center for Strategic and International Studies agrees that the preparation of the North Koreans for war is a key factor in preserving their outward legitimacy. None of the countless threats that have come out since the 1953 armistice have ever actually resulted in actual conflict, suggesting that despite the appearance of escalation, we may just be looking at business as usual here. In his own words, a large reason for that has been the U.S. security commitment to South Korea, the presence of United States forces in South Korea, USFK, to support that commitment, and the role of the United Nations Command, UNC, in maintaining the armistice. Deterrence has worked. There's every reason to believe that is the case today. The line is affirmed by the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who said that the U.S. and South Korean alliance is one of the most robust, capable, and interoperable alliances on Earth that has deterred greater conflict on the Korean Peninsula for several decades. If necessary, we remain ready to fight tonight. This is a war of words and military posturing, and if we're lucky, it'll remain in the rhetorical arena rather than the nuclear one. Seiler also highlights that many recent points of concern, such as Kim's cooling on the concept of reunification, are not unprecedented moves. Political analysts believe it's part of a broader de-risking strategy that the DPRK has been employing since the Russian invasion of Ukraine put global international relations on a knife edge. The risk here is the negative consequences of interactions with allies, exposure to their influence, and potential intel leakage. As we mentioned earlier when discussing the information war angle, North Korea's status quo is surprisingly delicate, which is why they need to use totalitarian tactics to maintain it. Cultural and even diplomatic exchange might weaken Kim's strongman bargaining position and send the country into unknown waters, waters in which the Kim dynasty could end up drowning if they're not careful. Alliances become severed, embassies are closed, and borders are secured. It's a technique that makes a diplomatic, tactical retreat seem like an act of strength from the DPRK. Data on Kim's wider actions also seem to suggest that the threats of war are just as superficial as they've always been. During the 9th enlarged plenum of the 8th WPK Central Committee and the 19th enlarged meeting of the Political Bureau of the 8th Central Committee of the WPK, both very long-winded names for some important North Korean political meetings, Kim stressed the importance of economic development and the hard times ahead. Investments in economic rejuvenation over pooling all resources for the war machine suggests that going on the offensive isn't a real priority for the DPRK in the immediate future, regardless of what threats are being uttered by North Korean spokespeople. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't take North Korea's military aspirations seriously in a long-term strategic sense. According to a report published by the White House, the DPRK has been, quote, seeking military assistance from Russia, including fighter aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, armored vehicles, ballistic missile production equipment or materials, and other advanced technologies. It goes without saying that Russia's own position as a military power on the world stage has been somewhat diminished by a long series of embarrassments during the war in Ukraine, which has resulted in them cozying up closer to the DPRK and in the process increasing Kim's confidence to act militarily bullish towards South Korea and the US. Why? Because of a theory in political science known as the stability-instability paradox, which dictates in simplified terms that while major wars between two nuclear powers are unlikely, small-scale conflicts become more likely. While nuclear weapons are, for obvious reasons, one of the main points of concern when North Korea is rampantly threatening war, you can't underestimate the destructive power of North Korea's conventional weapons arsenal, which is sure to unleash absolute hell on major population centers like Seoul in South Korea, during the opening salvos of a reignited Korean War. Engaging in conventional warfare against the southern neighbors is an increased possibility with extra weapons and artillery from Russia. International relations can scoot forward by inches or advance at breakneck speeds, so any of these situations can change quickly. We can only hope that on the whole, cooler heads prevail and the constant empty threats of war from Pyongyang remain empty for the foreseeable future. Because if they don't, we're all in for a world of trouble. Famine, the brainwashing of your friends, family, and children, unreasonable laws that can land you and everyone you love in a labor camp or worse, publicly executed for infractions as minor as listening to foreign music. It simply is too much for some North Koreans to bear. Desperate to escape, a select few take their lives into their own hands, risking it all to escape Kim Jong-un's grasp so they can start new lives in other countries. But unfortunately, the numbers that make it out alive have been falling since 2005. According to Statista, 1,384 North Koreans managed to defect in that year. The numbers generally increased from there, reaching a peak of 2,914 in 2009. Then, it all started to go downhill. For the next 10 years, the number of people who successfully escaped kept declining, with 2019 seeing the lowest number of defectors since 2005, just 1,047 people. Then the pandemic hit, and with it, North Korea panicked to the point where it closed its borders completely, even shutting down trade into the country. Just 229 people escaped in 2020, with 2021 seeing only 63 people make it away from North Korea. The following year wasn't much better, just 67 escaped in 2022, but Statista says that in 2023, it was an uptick. Up to September 2023, 319 North Koreans had successfully fled. We don't know all of their stories. Many have escaped and then disappeared into new lives in the hope that Kim Jong-un will never find them. However, a select few have stories to share that reveal how the only people to escape North Korea managed to flee in 2023. It all starts with a man named Mr. Kim. At the beginning of 2023, he pulled off a daring escape, fleeing North Korea by sea along with his mother, his brother's family, and his heavily pregnant wife. In an interview with the BBC, Mr. Kim, accompanied by a plainclothes police officer, recounted his story. There's been a lot of suffering, he said as he explained how North Korea responded to the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Kim says that life in North Korea became even harder once the pandemic hit, with the state broadcasting images of people dying from the virus all over the world, while instituting hard rules about what North Koreans had to do to avoid death themselves. Propaganda ramped up. Kim and his country people were told that failing to follow the new pandemic rules would lead to all of North Korea being wiped out. Whenever a case of COVID-19 was suspected, armed guards would arrive to quarantine an entire town or village. The people left inside couldn't get out, meaning they had no access to food outside of what was already in the town when it went into lockdown. Kim says that North Korean forces used these quarantines to exert their control. After locking down a town for several days, starving its people in the process, the government would arrive with trucks to deliver food supplies. They claimed to be selling that food cheaply, but the reality was that the state was using the pandemic to break people's spirits. Kim says they made these claims to receive praise, quote, like starving your baby, then giving them a small amount so it would thank you. Questions started to arise in Kim's mind. He began to question the state, believing that it was using the pandemic to make a profit rather than instituting quarantines to help North Korea's people. And as more people he knew caught and survived COVID-19, he began to question whether the state had exaggerated the dangers. He started to believe that North Korea's harsh lockdowns, which involved closing its own borders, were simply an excuse to suppress people. Worse yet, he began to hear about people starving. By closing its borders, North Korea had shut out food supplies from other countries. Food prices skyrocketed, and families were left with very little to eat. As Kim said, you'd wake up one morning and hear, "Oh, someone in this district starved to death." Those reports kept rolling in, with Kim pointing out that even North Korea's farmers were not immune from dwindling food supplies. The state would force those with a poor harvest to deliver their own food, leaving them with precious little to eat. Perhaps it's for these reasons that North Korea applied to the World Food Program for help in March 2023. Regardless, Kim managed to survive in these difficult conditions for years. He set himself up as a grasshopper seller, a peddler of black market goods, making enough money to afford stew for his family. As Kim pointed out, that counts as eating very well in North Korea. Still, Kim was far from comfortable. Being a black market seller in North Korea means that people are constantly willing to report you for your activities. After all, by reporting Kim, another North Korean could get their hands on some much-needed food or financial aid. Kim says that he often had to make quick escapes when he sensed that state authorities were on their way. packing up his merchandise and going into hiding before resuming his illicit career the next day. He says that he fantasized about escaping hundreds of times before he actually made his attempt, but it was the tragic death of one of his friends that forced him over the edge. That friend wanted something simple to achieve in most other countries, a divorce from his wife. But the state told him that divorce wasn't possible unless he submitted to being sent to a labor camp. Kim's friend was devastated. He accumulated more and more debt trying to find a way out of his marriage until it all became too much. Kim's friend took his own life. He says that a visit to that friend's bedroom was one of his sparks that ignited his escape plan. According to Kim, his friend had clawed the walls of his bedroom to the point where his nails came out. That's how he knew that he needed to escape. But Kim also knew that it wouldn't be easy. He had a family in North Korea that he didn't want to leave behind, meaning that any escape plan he formulated would have to involve them. So Kim started talking to his brother. It was an easy task to convince him. Along with his wife, Kim's brother had made a living by selling illicit seafood. The state cracked down, making it impossible for him to fish even though he had his own boat. When Kim came calling, he found a brother who was more than willing to plan an escape with him. That was mid-2022. The brothers spent 7 months plotting their escape from there, though they soon ran into challenges. Many of the traditional escape routes, such as those along North Korea's northern border with China, had been cut off during the pandemic, meaning crossing over on foot was not an option. Thankfully, it wouldn't have to be. Both Kim and his brother lived in the southwest of the country, giving them another choice for escape: by sea to South Korea. But they simply couldn't jump into Kim's brother's boat and set sail. Permission to access the waters they'd use in their escape was needed, leading to Kim's brother enrolling in a military scheme. He would have permission to enter the waters, the military said, as long as he caught fish that the soldiers could sell to fund their equipment. As Kim's brother set to work in a, quote, official capacity, Kim himself started speaking to the security guards and coast guards who patrolled the coast. He made friends with several, learning about their shift patterns and protocols, until he realized that with the right timing, he and his brother could take their boat out at night without being caught. The plan started to take shape. But Kim still had another important task to complete: convincing his wife and elderly mother to make the trip with him. Neither wanted to go. The risks were simply too great. Eventually, through a lot of shouting and cajoling, Kim convinced his mother to make the trip by telling her that he wouldn't leave without her and that she'd be responsible for his misery if she stayed. Some may see this as an underhanded tactic, but to Kim it was necessary to ensure his family stayed together. Unfortunately, his wife proved a tougher nut to crack. She was steadfast in her refusal to leave until she discovered that she was pregnant. Kim successfully argued that he and his wife were now going to be responsible for another life and that they shouldn't raise their child in a hellhole. There was still more to do before Kim could execute his plan. Fearful of how the state might treat his father's grave when he left, desecration of graves of defectors' relatives is apparently common in North Korea. Kim boldly dug up his father's remains, taking the body into the nearby wilderness. Kim says he burned it to ashes, packing the cremated remains into an urn to take with him. For the first time in a long time, his family was united. However, before they could make the trip, Kim would need to navigate a minefield in the dark to reach his brother's boat. Pretending to pick herbs, Kim slowly mapped out a route through the mines, which had been recently planted to stop people from leaving. It was a risky gambit, but Kim knew this area wasn't well patrolled because the mines were supposed to be enough to stop people from running. He took his time, worked out his route, and with the minefield successfully mapped, he had one thing left to do: wait. Kim needed both the weather and the tide to be in his favor if his escape was to be successful. So he waited until a day when the low tide and rainy weather could be used to obscure his escape. He didn't need clear weather. That would make his boat easier to spot. Kim needed a day when the sea warning was in place, which would usually only come when a storm was brewing. He'd then have a chance to use it to obscure himself from North Korea's radar systems, gaining enough ground without being spotted that he could make his final push successfully. The big day came. On May 6th, the sea warning was issued and the tide was coming in. Kim and his family sneaked through the minefield and got to his brother's boat. By 10 p.m., they were in the water, sailing as far as they were permitted under his brother's agreement with the military. And then they kept going. The low tide worked in Kim's favor. It exposed rocks, boulders, and reefs, all of which Kim and his family used to disguise their small vessel from the radar systems designed to catch unapproved boats in the water. That, combined with the rain, allowed Kim to camouflage his vessel as floating rubbish. Slowly but surely, Kim's boat edged toward the maritime border until he felt it was safe to pick up speed. Then he activated the throttle. According to Kim, he looked back to see a large ship following. The state knew that he was escaping, but the vessel it had sent simply wasn't fast enough to keep up. Kim and his family managed to ride the currents until they crossed the maritime border into South Korea. "In that moment, all my tension released," said Kim. "I felt like I was collapsing." Free for the first time of North Korea's oppression, Kim sailed his brother's boat toward the island of Yeonpyeong, flashing his lights as he did until the South Korean Navy spotted and rescued him and his family. However, he wasn't yet free to start his new life. Ever wary of North Korean spies, the South Korean National Intelligence Service detained Kim and his family for interviews to determine if they were truly defectors. Satisfied with Kim's answers, the service then placed him and his family into a resettlement facility where they were taught about life in South Korea. The transition would be tough. In October 2023, the family moved into an apartment together, just in time for Kim's wife to give birth. Small things that seemed so common to most, such as riding the subway, were alien to Kim and his family. But they are adapting, and with time, they'll fully ingratiate themselves into their new society. "It feels like I was born a second time," Kim says when talking about his new life. Speaking to the Japan Times, he says that he'd never seen a plane flying through the sky when he lived in North Korea. Now he sees them regularly, and thanks to a special job fair held for North Korean defectors, he has a chance of landing his dream role as a ship's navigator. Mr. Kim's escape set the blueprint for how North Korean defectors escaped the country in 2023. In the days when several thousand people left North Korea every year, the country's border with China used to be the default choice. As Pastor Stephen Kim, who works for JM Missionary to help North Koreans escape via China, points out, about 1,000 people used to make their way over the Chinese border annually. Since the pandemic, that number has dropped to just 20, with Kim saying that he only knows of 4 of those escapees who managed to make their way to South Korea. Others he suspects were detained in China and possibly sent back to North Korea. That leaves only the sea as an option for escape in 2023. As Sukil Park of Liberty in North Korea points out, he says that the types of escapes conducted by people like Mr. Kim have always been rare, unsurprising given what we know of Kim's story, and that many likely don't succeed. These sea escapes take meticulous planning, incredible bravery, and for everything to go miraculously well, he says. There must be many more North Koreans who have tried but not made it. Mr. Kim was one of the lucky ones. Though not all of the details of his daring escape have been independently corroborated, it's clear that he placed himself and his family in immense danger to build a new life. And he's not the only one. Though Kim's account is the most detailed story we have from a North Korean defector in 2023, he's not the only one who braved the harsh waters. In October 2023, several news outlets, including Al Jazeera and the BBC, reported on a small group of suspected defectors who were discovered by the South Korean Coast Guard. The group of 4 had made their crossing in a small wooden boat, all claiming to want to defect to South Korea. They were found on the coast near Sokcho, a city just 32 miles away from Seoul. Though few details are known about this group, they were likely treated the same way as Kim and his family, meaning that they would have been detained and questioned before being sent to a resettlement facility. But in this case, the South Korean authorities are still remaining tight-lipped, perhaps to protect the anonymity of these defectors. Still, it appears that they followed the blueprint created by Mr. Kim. Their small wooden boat was agile enough to evade the larger ships patrolling North Korea's waters. The craft was also inconspicuous enough to blend in with the boulders and reefs that appear on the country's coasts during low tide. Like Kim, these 4 defectors took a massive risk, and sadly, any future defectors will likely have to do the same. After all, crossing over into China isn't an option anymore, and that's not solely because North Korea has shored up its defenses against defection across the border. China appears to be cooperating with North Korea. In December 2023, the South China Morning Post reported on a visit made by a senior North Korean diplomat to Beijing. These rare talks are apparently part of China's efforts to strengthen its relationship with North Korea, with the 2 parties agreeing to improve their, quote, strategic communication and coordination. What that might mean on a geopolitical scale isn't fully known, but for any who wish to escape from North Korea into China, this increased cooperation spells bad news. A Reuters report published just days before the South China Morning Post article points out that North Koreans who were in China have started, quote, disappearing. Reuters highlights information from the Transitional Justice Working Group, or TJWG, which claims that China sent 600 North Koreans back for repatriation in October alone. TJWG says these 600 people have simply vanished, and it warns that they likely face imprisonment, perhaps in North Korea's labor camps, as well as sexual violence and execution now that they're back home. TJWG says that the defectors were loaded onto buses and vans to be driven back to North Korea, with the incident being the largest mass repatriation in many years. Most of those sent back were women. Their prospects don't look good, especially given that North Korea's state media brands defectors as, quote, human scum. For its part, China has downplayed its actions, claiming that North Koreans they sent back weren't true defectors. Instead, they had entered China for economic reasons, with Beijing sending them back being a simple case of them following the letter of their own law. Many would disagree. From the outside looking in, it would appear as though a deal has been struck. In exchange for North Korea's cooperation, China is sending defectors back to a country that will treat them as less than human. It's essentially a death sentence. Escaping into China simply isn't an option anymore. And it wouldn't be surprising to see more groups being sent back to Pyongyang as ties between China and North Korea strengthen. So, North Korean defectors are faced with a near impossible choice. On the one hand, they could try to take advantage of the fact that North Korea has recently reopened its borders with China to try to escape the traditional way. It won't be easy. Even with trade routes reopened, Pyongyang has boosted border security to the point where it's much harder to cross now than it was before the pandemic. And even if somebody manages to make the crossing, they'll enter a country that's just as likely to send them back as it is to accept them. Or they do what Mr. Kim and his family and the 4 defectors found huddled in a small wooden boat did: brave the dangerous waters that separate North and South Korea. Believe it or not, that might be an even more difficult route out of North Korea. Minefields near the coast, patrolling ships, radar systems, they all combine to stop most escape attempts, even if the few who are successful at least make it to South Korea and a new life where they're accepted and rehabilitated. Alternatively, there is a third option. According to the NK News, the third quarter of 2023 saw 40 North Korean defectors leave China to reach South Korea. The outlet says that the threat of repatriation is so high that the defectors are essentially willing to defect again, leaving the place that they've called home for several years to avoid the possibility of being sent back to North Korea. Hannah Song, who works for North Korean Human Rights, one of the few organizations allowed to interview defectors after they leave, says that most of the 40 came from China and that many had spent 10 years or more there. Perhaps 2 border crossings over land would be safer than 1 via sea. By crossing into China before immediately making their way to South Korea, defectors may have a chance to start their new lives without braving minefields and the North Korean Navy, but they'll still face risk. Beyond mass deportations, China is estimated to be holding 2,000 North Koreans in prison, according to the United Nations. Cross to South Korea by sea, start a covert life in China, or use China as an opportunity to cross into South Korea. All are near impossible routes of escape, and yet over 300 North Koreans have made it via these routes in 2023. Will 2024 see more escapees manage to follow in Mr. Kim's footsteps? Only time will tell. Winds were carrying a fierce storm in from the south, causing the sea's waves to crash violently. And yet, this was all part of a meticulous plan, one several months in the making. Turbulent conditions on the water could deter surveillance ships from following after all. But even then, that did little to deter the impending sense of fear that Mr. Kim felt. He was about to attempt something that, if there was even one slight misstep, could see him and his entire family punished in some of the worst ways imaginable. He was about to attempt escape from North Korea. With his brother alongside him, Mr. Kim gathered up his brother's children. In order to keep them calm and avoid their frightened cries raising alarm, they had been drugged with sleeping pills, rendering them totally unconscious. While it might seem like an act of cruelty to drug children, it was done to make it easier for Mr. Kim and his brother to cross one of the numerous inhumane measures used to prevent citizens from escaping North Korea: fields of landmines. Even worse, they had to navigate their way in total darkness, avoiding the possibility that one step in the wrong spot could spell certain death. Mr. Kim and his brother had surveyed the minefield from a distance, not long before their attempted escape. While pretending to harvest medicinal herbs near the coast, they mapped a safe route across, aided by the fact that the explosive mines had only been planted recently. As a result, there were fewer guards around. After all, what's the point of standing guard when a landmine can do the job just as well? Crossing the treacherous field was still the safest option, which speaks to how dire the other routes, if any, would have been. It was all down to waiting for the right time to make the escape, and that came down to the weather and the tide. Why? Well, because Mr. Kim and his brother would be making their getaway by sea. Every successful footstep across the minefield must have felt like an overwhelming relief, and yet put all the more pressure on the next step. Inching further and further, Mr. Kim made sure to avoid the sweeping flashlight beams of the few guards that were near the area. Waiting for them on the other side of the deadly minefield was a seemingly defunct old boat, moored and ready for the next stage of Mr. Kim's plan. Living in a small fishing town on the far southwestern side of North Korea, Mr. Kim and his family had known that escaping by sea was risky. But some of the more well-established escape routes that involved heading north to cross the country's border with China had been blocked off thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as some worrying new agreements between the DPRK and their neighbors. Mr. Kim and his family wouldn't be able to cross the waters of the south of the country without permission, of course. But his brother had heard of a military base nearby that sent civilians out to catch fish, which were then sold to pay for military equipment. Once his brother had enrolled as a volunteer, Mr. Kim started befriending some of the Coast Guard and the security guards who patrolled the area, gathering information all the while. He observed the patterns of their shifts, their protocols, and patrol routes until he was sure it would be possible for him and his family to escape by boat. So they took Mr. Kim's brother's boat out at night, careful not to get caught as he'd been banned from fishing in it. Once it had been discreetly moored, it was ready for their getaway. Clambering aboard the fishing boat, Mr. Kim hid his brother's children. He disguised them, intending to make them look like bags of tools by stashing their sleeping bodies in old grain sacks. Once the children were safe and secure, the rest of the family set sail. Along with Mr. Kim and his brother was their elderly mother, who had been reluctant to leave given the risk, despite how unbearable life in North Korea had been for them. Both her sons had yelled at her, threatening to call off their plan unless she agreed to join them, and saying that they'd hold her responsible for the family's continued misery if they were to stay. Also joining them were the wives of both Mr. Kim and his brother. Mr. Kim's wife had also held serious reservations about trying to escape, but once Mr. Kim learned she was pregnant, he was determined for his wife and child not to stay in North Korea any longer. The Kim brothers armed themselves with swords, bracing themselves for any trouble. There was still a chance they could run afoul of the Coast Guard. Each of the women were given an empty, hollowed-out eggshell containing black sand and chili powder to crack in the Coast Guard's faces should the worst happen. Their entire journey as they set sail toward South Korea was wrought with tension. If they were discovered, they'd surely be executed. They sailed past the furthest permitted reaches of North Korean waters, then kept going. As if evading the Coast Guard and avoiding being caught wasn't enough for the Kim family to contend with, the low tides left reefs and large rocks exposed, which posed potential dangers to their getaway boat. They could have easily gotten stuck or damaged the vessel, stranding them at the mercy of the perilous ocean or worse, the patrols who would have them hauled back to the DPRK. They were forced to navigate their boat with care through the obstacles, but going too fast would risk detection on the radar as well. The goal was to drift slow enough to be mistaken for floating debris by other boats, but while also maintaining enough control over their boat to avoid wreckage. It was a delicate, difficult task, with the fate of Mr. Kim's whole family hanging in the balance. After some time out on the water, the family believed they had crossed the northern limit line, placing them out of the North Korean waters into those that were considered the territory of the South. Once they were certain they were far enough away, they fired up the engine and sailed faster, heading in the direction of Yeonpyeong, a group of small islands in the Yellow Sea that are part of South Korea. But as they picked up speed, the attention they'd been trying to avoid all night finally fell on them. Behind them, Mr. Kim spotted a ship following. They'd accelerated too early and weren't as close as they thought. The boat sped on through the water, full speed against the current, cutting through the waves, crashing against the escape vessel. In the distance, the light of the Coast Guard was tailing them, but it wasn't close. There was still a chance. They just needed to make it across the maritime border between the waters of the north and the south. Racing ahead, the boat following them couldn't catch up before the Kims had crossed into South Korean waters and sailed even closer to Yeonpyeong. They flashed their boats alight as they approached, catching the attention of the South Korean Navy, who sailed out to assist them. To Mr. Kim's overwhelming relief, he had pulled off an exceptionally difficult escape and felt all the tension and worry he had, leaving him in a sudden rush. As if aided by a miracle, everything had gone exactly according to plan, and he'd done what was thought to be impossible and gotten his whole family out of North Korea. Sadly, Mr. Kim's story is hardly one that's typical of everyone attempting to leave the brutal regime within the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Thanks to their supreme leader, Kim Jong-un, the country remains one of the most repressive authoritarian places in the world. The people living under the regime are subjected to flagrant disregard for human rights, as well as potential starvation thanks to food shortages, worsened by the massive wealth disparity that allows the North Korean elites freedoms that aren't afforded to ordinary citizens. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, escape from North Korea has only gotten harder for those seeking a better life outside its borders. Kim Jong-un's government was able to prevent the spread of the coronavirus as a way to further restrict its people's opportunities to defect. According to testimony from defectors like Mr. Kim, the state also increased the spreading of propaganda that increased the citizens' paranoia surrounding COVID, televising images of deaths all around the world and threatening that all of North Korea would be swept with death if rules were not obeyed. In some instances, people were even sent to labor camps for not following North Korea's COVID restrictions. Whenever there was a suspected case of COVID in an area, Kim Jong-un's troops would enforce a military quarantine of the affected town or village, sealing it off and even leaving those inside with little to eat or nothing at all. Then, when people were starving, truckloads of food would be brought in and sold at cheap prices in order to make the people praise the North Korean government's relief efforts. In short, they were capitalizing on the pandemic, using it to make those who wanted to leave much more afraid to even consider the possibility. North Korean citizens are afforded very little mobility. They cannot freely travel around their own country or travel to another, even temporarily. The regime treats anyone who leaves North Korea as a defector and considers it an act of treason that's punishable by death. The guards stationed at the border are under strict orders to indiscriminately shoot on sight anyone they see trying to leave North Korea without authorization. Anyone that risks escaping not only risks being shot at and potentially killed as a result, but should they be injured by the guards and brought back to the DPRK, they can potentially face being tortured, being executed for the entire public to witness, or being sent to a slave labor camp for the rest of their life, along with their entire family. Between North and South Korea is the Demilitarized Zone, a roughly 150-mile strip of land separating the two countries with thousands of troops on either side. It's considered to be the most heavily fortified border in the world. Trying to escape into South Korea through this area is virtually impossible, not in the least part thanks to the estimated 1 million landmines that litter the area. Some were even left behind after the Korean War. However, that doesn't make them any less deadly. Landmines are thought to remain operational for decades after being placed and activated. And to make navigating across the DMZ even more of a fatally futile task, there is no way of knowing where all those mines are scattered. So one step in the wrong lump of earth underfoot could spell a very swift, highly explosive ending to an escape attempt. In order to cross from one Korea to the other, a person would have to survive not only landmines, but getting through electrified wire fences on either side, as well as the combat-ready soldiers standing ready at all times, in the event that a war erupts between the North and South. To that end, North Korea has placed thousands of artillery weapons near the DMZ as a deterrent against invasion. There's supposedly enough artillery there to shower South Korea's capital city, Seoul, with a devastating bombardment of over 10,000 shells per minute. Despite the difficulty faced by those attempting to flee there, it's not hard to see why some North Koreans choose to defect to the south. As well as being able to escape the grips of the regime, there comes the added benefit of sharing a language, heritage, and history with the South Koreans. Add that to the fact that South Korea actively welcomes defectors from the North and takes them in, even offering them a guaranteed citizenship, then it becomes hard to see why so many of those seeking to defect from North Korea head there, provided they can survive the numerous deadly obstacles standing between them in the demilitarized zone or in the waters between North and South Korea. Someone escaping to neighboring countries other than South Korea might not find themselves being welcomed with open arms. At the northern border of the DPRK, on the other side of the Yalu and Tumen rivers, lies another country that offers a potential sanctuary for those seeking to escape from Kim Jong-un's oppressive rule, or at least somewhere that used to seem like a viable place to flee to: China. At one time, this was the most popular option for defectors, crossing into China and from there often navigating their way further north toward Mongolia or southward toward Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, or Thailand, all countries that are aligned with the South Korean government and their goal of reunifying both Koreas. However, in more recent years, fleeing to China or even passing through there to seek asylum in the more sympathetic countries has become a lot harder for North Korea's would-be escapees. You see, in recent years, there's been a notable improvement in the diplomatic relations between North Korea and its northernmost neighbors. This has led to agreements with not only China but also Russia, which also shares a border with one of the northernmost regions of North Korea. Those agreements have actively made exiting the DPRK into either China or Russia considerably harder for those seeking asylum and citizenship elsewhere. While the DPRK deepens its cooperative relationships with China and Russia, North Korea has simultaneously remained resistant to diplomatic negotiations with the Western world, which makes it much harder for other nations to do anything to aid those affected by the human rights violations inflicted by Kim Jong-un and his regime. Back during the pandemic, while also restricting its citizens' movement within the country, North Korea also clamped down on international travel and started enforcing their borders much more strictly in response to the spread of COVID-19. Aware that defectors were traveling to China, the DPRK established a series of border buffer zones in 2020, and this area would soon be sealed within several large barriers standing between the two countries. Kim Jong-un would eventually reopen the borders to some extent, although not to allow his citizens mobility. It was primarily to improve North Korea's trade and relations with their northernmost neighbors. Once this had occurred, China began to intensify the security around their side of the border, increasing the number of road checkpoints and random checks. This made it increasingly difficult for activists working within China, as well as South Korea, trying to aid those seeking to defect from the DPRK, as attempting to transit people out of North Korea to a safer country by going through China was made all the harder. Some North Koreans that were able to make it into China were forced to hide in safe houses, sometimes for months, while the Chinese government searched for them. Thanks to agreements between both countries, any North Korean escapees that are caught fleeing into China are forcibly deported back to the DPRK by Chinese authorities. This often involves those seeking to leave North Korea being physically assaulted and sent to labor camps as punishment after they're made to return against their will. What's interesting is that according to international law, China is not permitted to return civilians to any territory where their lives would be threatened, or where they'd be at risk of being tortured or subjected to other violations of their basic human rights. This is known as the principle of non-refoulement, and it's a component of several international treaties that China itself has previously agreed to, including the United Nations Refugee Convention. Given that it is a certainty that those fleeing North Korea will be punished if they are returned to the DPRK, China is obligated to treat these people as refugees in need of protection and shelter. Yet in spite of this, China universally applies the label of illegal economic migrants to all of those attempting to defect from North Korea. By disregarding any obligation to protect those North Korean refugees, instead routinely arresting and repatriating them, the Chinese government is effectively sending these people back to the DPRK to face crimes against humanity, according to a United Nations Commission of Inquiry. On top of that, some aid workers found to be assisting North Korean escapees are also subjected to harassment and sometimes even imprisonment at the hands of Chinese authorities. This naturally makes it difficult for these activists and aid workers to meet with North Koreans that escape into China, since the defectors are forced to live in hiding and are often fearful of strangers who they worry might report them to the Chinese authorities. One Seoul-based human rights group that had been tracking the number of North Koreans detained in China believed that around 600 of these innocent people had seemingly vanished. Communication is naturally much harder to establish, both from within the DPRK's regime and from outside trying to reach people inside North Korea. But in 2023, the Transitional Justice Working Group found they were unable to get in touch with any of these 600 people who had supposedly been returned to North Korea after being repatriated from China. In order to conduct such a large-scale deportation, the Chinese government is thought to have used buses and vans to transport detained North Koreans from their detention centers in the Jilin and Liaoning provinces, despite researchers and activists pointing to the estimated numbers of people thought to have fled into China from North Korea. The Chinese government had made no public acknowledgments of those refugees, refusing to confirm that it detained or deported them. Fortunately, this hasn't made defecting outright impossible, just considerably more dangerous than it already was. Those like Mr. Kim who have been able to identify North Korea's duplicitous strategy during the pandemic, realizing COVID was survivable and the more people who contracted it and lived made it clear the virus was being used as a further excuse by the regime to oppress its citizens. While this realization didn't stop the problems posed by the much tighter border closures between North Korea and its neighbors, in the years since the pandemic began, there's been an influx of people defecting to South Korea. In 2023, the amount almost tripled when compared with 2022 and 2021, with border closures surrounding North Korea becoming more relaxed in line with the reduced number of global COVID cases, as well as readily available vaccinations against the coronavirus. A number of brave DPRK citizens have made the dangerous journey to freedom, attempting to escape thanks to a myriad of factors, most commonly dissent toward Kim Jong-un's regime and the threat of starvation thanks to food shortages. 196 people were able to safely make it to the South in 2023. While that figure still falls short of the average number of north to south defectors from before the pandemic began, there seems to be a more widespread trend of people within the DPRK harboring discontent toward their old government. Interestingly, while conditions are often considerably better for the wealthy elites of North Korea, such as diplomats, senior government officials, and their families, even a number of them have opted to defect as well. These elites are given access to far more freedoms than the average North Korean citizen, especially those living within the capital city of Pyongyang, who are able to enjoy luxuries like cinemas, department stores, indoor gyms, air conditioning, and smartphones. However, South Korean officials have reported that 10 of these North Korean elites were among those that left the DPRK in 2023, making this the highest number from that social group to defect since 2017. Although it's also worth noting that the wealth and connections that these people have would make it a lot easier for them to defect from the DPRK. This number also included North Korean citizens who had been living overseas, including diplomats and government officials, since that freedom of movement isn't given to ordinary people in North Korea. Apparently, after being asked to return to the DPRK to aid with the pandemic, these officials opted instead to divert their wealth and connections into heading for the South, supposedly after having become disenchanted by their lives back home after experiencing what it's like to live in freer countries. Unfortunately, the ease with which the wealthier North Korean people have been able to escape isn't possible for its ordinary citizens. Since the 1950s, some 31,000 North Koreans have managed to reach the South safely, with many previously able to cross into China or another country in order to make a new life for themselves in South Korea, free from the grip of the DPRK and Kim Jong-un's regime. The year is 1969, and North Korea has long been a thorn in the U.S.'s side. Backed up by the Soviet Union, North Korea's aggression toward the South is kept in check only by a very tight leash held by the Kremlin and the threat of American military response. However, the North Koreans chafe against the presence of Americans on the peninsula, the only roadblock in their quest to unite the two nations by force. In order to keep tabs on the communist bloc nations, the United States operates a reconnaissance program known as Beggar Shadow. The program uses spy aircraft flying safely over international waters and well away from the airspace of the nations they're monitoring. Yet their powerful radars and eavesdropping technologies allow them to pick up communications between military units deep inside the hostile territory. At 7 a.m. on Tuesday, the 15th of April, 1969, an American EC-121M with the call sign Deep Sea 129 took off from Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan and made for the Korean coast. Aboard it were 8 officers and 23 enlisted men, and their task was routine by now: loiter near the Korean coast and eavesdrop on North Korean communications. The flight route would take it within 50 miles of the Korean coast, where it would fly a racetrack-like route that would take it north near the Soviet Union's coast before turning back for Asan Air Base in South Korea. Rated as minimal risk, the mission had been carried out for 2 years without incident, and in the first 3 months of 1969, almost 200 similar missions had already been flown by the U.S. Navy and Air Force. This day, however, was different, and at 12:34 local time, 6 hours into the mission, radars in South Korea detected the takeoff of 2 North Korean MiG-21s. Assuming that they were responding to Deep Sea 129, the planes were tracked and the spy plane was warned. But being safely over international waters, it wasn't believed the plane was in danger. Then, suddenly, an hour after they took off, the jets made for Deep Sea 129 at what was clearly closing speed, and the American plane was warned. Deep Sea 129 immediately aborted its mission and returned to base, but the surprised North Korean jets quickly caught up with it. On radar, American operators watched as the 2 radar tracks merged, and then Deep Sea 129's track disappeared. Initially, none of the agencies involved were concerned, as protocol dictated that deep sea descend below radar coverage if threatened by hostile aircraft. Though these early model MiG-21s did not carry onboard radar, conditions allowed the MiG pilots to visually spot Deep Sea 129. Soon it became clear the North Koreans had downed the plane with an air-to-air missile. Immediately after the attack, North Korean military forces went into high readiness. Back in Washington, President Nixon and his staff received news of the attack. Nixon was furious, but more than that, he was drunk too. Aides had described Nixon as having developed bouts of insomnia and as having taken to drinking. He had begun to display extreme bouts of aggression, further fueled by his growing reliance on alcohol. And when he got the call that night that the North Koreans had downed an American plane flying over international waters, Nixon's anger grew to apocalyptic levels. 31 Americans were dead, and Nixon immediately got on the phone with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ordered them to produce a list of targets for tactical nuclear strike. American nuclear bombers immediately went on standby as the Joint Chiefs drew up a list of recommendations for nuclear strikes deep inside North Korea. Within an hour, a list of targets were drawn up and sent to Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, as American planes prepared to carry out what might be the opening shots of World War III. The targets listed gave Nixon two options: a series of attacks to serve as a punitive action against North Korea, or a full-blown nuclear attack that would crush the regime and prevent a large-scale war, mostly by leaving little of North Korea behind. The first list included 12 targets ranging from command centers to airfields and naval bases, and incredibly, despite the use of 12 10-kiloton nuclear weapons, would produce casualties as few as 100 to a few thousand. The second list, however, included the use of 70-kiloton nuclear weapons to destroy all of North Korea's major airfields as well as its command and control centers. Casualties would be in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, though the vast majority of them would be military personnel. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were highly alarmed by Nixon's demand for a nuclear retaliation, as was Kissinger. If forced to carry out the attack, as Nixon had every legal right to do, the military warned that if they were going to strike with nuclear weapons, then they had best go all out and avoid the possibility of North Korea putting up much of a retaliation against forces in the South. This, of course, would immediately launch a war on the peninsula, but it was thought that North Korean forces would be so devastated they'd be able to offer little resistance. Launching on the first list of targets with the smaller-scale tactical nukes would only provoke North Korea into full-scale war, and with most of its forces intact. Yet, while North Korea could be utterly devastated in a surprise nuclear attack, the fallout, political and not just radiological, would be catastrophic for the United States. For the second time in history, the U.S. would launch a nuclear attack as an offensive measure, and this time it would utterly devastate an entire country in a surprise attack, a nuclear Pearl Harbor. This would completely destabilize relations with the Soviet Union and China both, and possibly prompt a nuclear response from the Russians. Even if there was no nuclear response from the Soviet Union, it would prove to the Soviets that a trigger-happy madman was in charge of things in the White House, and that nuclear war could be one drink away. This would make the careful system of checks and balances between the US and the Soviet Union that had so far averted nuclear conflict fall completely apart. Thankfully, Henry Kissinger postponed presenting the attack options to President Nixon until he had sobered up in the morning, by which time the prospect of launching a full-scale nuclear war seemed like a much less attractive option. Instead, the United States sent a task force led by the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Ticonderoga, Ranger, and Hornet to patrol off Korean waters and ensure the safety of all aircraft flying in the region. This would be the largest concentration of firepower in the region since the Korean War. For their part, the Soviet Union immediately dispatched 2 destroyers upon hearing of the downing of Deep Sea 129 in an effort to attempt to locate any surviving crew members and rescue them, or at the very least to secure the remains of the American airmen. The act was not just one of solidarity between the two Cold War rivals, but also meant to signal to Pyongyang how deeply displeased Moscow was with the shooting down of Deep Sea 129. What would your life be like if you were born in North Korea? It's kind of hard for those of us on the outside to imagine. The country's official media present a bizarre picture of impossibly loyal, leader-adoring ranks of civilians and military alike. To some extent, Western media replay those images without enough skepticism for the stagey propaganda. For viewers outside the control of that secretive state, however, the glimpses convey the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of happy socialist cadres, the people depicted come across as an undifferentiated, freakish mass. And rather than focusing on human interest features, Western news stories now tend to show a rocket blasting off, perhaps followed by a map graphic showing the missile's potential radius. None of that has much to do with daily life in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as the isolated country is officially known. Even though the military and the Workers' Party of Korea remain central institutions, the focus of daily life for most North Koreans has nothing to do with politics or war. The government was once literally revered in the figures of Kim Jong-il, and especially the nation's founding father Kim Il-sung. Now the state is something of an economic means to an end at best, and more often an unavoidable annoyance, not to mention a continuing object of fear. For a generation now, most North Koreans have lived experiences that demonstrate the patent lies of the state media. They just have to be careful who they admit it to. There was a time when everyone in North Korea made their living working for the government, and many were happy to do it. In the 1950s, the DPRK's economy was actually stronger than that of their rival, US-allied South Korea. During the days of Japanese colonization, the northern part of the peninsula was modernized for heavy industry. The South, with more favorable agricultural conditions, started off their independent era with less industrial infrastructure. In the 1960s and 70s, North Korea continued along in economic security, as their neighbors in China struggled to emerge from years of deadly famine. By the 1980s, the equipment, factories, railways, and power grid that North Korea depended on was aging, as was the case in many communist countries of the era. Pretty much everyone was poor, but few were genuinely destitute. And then the bottom fell out. The prevailing philosophy during the long reign of Kim Il-sung was juche, or self-reliance. It was a matter of pride that North Koreans were in control of their own economic destiny, growing and manufacturing most of what they needed domestically. Without a doubt, the people of North Korea were incredibly industrious, but what the country's leader didn't mention was the incredible amount of support that poured in the country from China and the Soviet Union. Trading goods at a loss amounted to an indirect subsidy from neighboring giants. Most crucially, North Korea's fuel supply depended upon assistance from the USSR. And when quite suddenly there was no USSR anymore, North Korea was in trouble. The loss of foreign trade and the fuel shortage in the early 1990s started a literal death spiral for the people of North Korea. Factory production slowed. Without sufficient fertilizers or machinery, farm production slumped. There was now simply less food to go around. In those days, wages were supplemented with direct food distribution by the state. That stopped. Raw materials stopped reaching factories, and workers, left with nothing to do, were now also receiving virtually no compensation. Production of everything basically halted, and people began to starve. Many of the experiences of ordinary North Koreans in this time of destitution and during the era of radical economic change that followed are taken from North Korea Confidential by Daniel Tudor and James Pearson, who show ways that the closed society has found some openings, and Barbara Demick's Nothing to Envy, which chronicles the lives of people in North Korea's far northeastern industrial region. Demick's stories, in turn, come in large part from defectors who lived through the misery. What little residual momentum was left in North Korea's state-run economy effectively died when poor growing conditions in the mid-1990s caused massive crop failures. Now, even the last vestiges of public food distribution ended. Hospitals filled with the sick and starving, and then they emptied. Those who were growing their own small gardens, the only form of private production allowed, had a little bit of a buffer, but that was no help to city dwellers. Stories of people eating tree bark and grass in those days are no exaggeration. Those who could do so hunted wild animals until they became a rarity. People scraped food out of bilge and animal dung. Exaggerated rumors raised the specter of cannibalism among the country's already suffering public. Foreign aid came in, but the regime refused to allow aid groups to distribute it themselves. Incompetence may have played some role in the poor allocation, but part of the problem was certainly a callous undervaluation of the lives of some citizens. The policy under Kim Jong-il was Songun, or military first. Those who were considered important to the state and its defense might live. Others were on their own. A low estimate for the number of deaths in the North Korean famine of the 1990s is 240,000, but it may have been as high as 600,000. The higher figure would represent a staggering 10% of the population. In a reference to a well-known story of Kim Il-sung's alleged victory over the Japanese in World War II, the era of economic depression in the 1990s became known as the Arduous March. It was in those days of misery among the ruins of the command economy that an unusual form of capitalism sprouted up. As a corollary to the acceptance of kitchen gardens, beginning in the 1980s, the regime reluctantly granted people the right to trade produce at outdoor neighborhood markets, known as Jangmadang. At the height of the famine, for many, an informal Jangmadang in one's village or neighborhood might be the only place to obtain food. People developed a system of bartering. It was illegal to sell newly manufactured products in an informal market, but people would bring in secondhand goods, and people with different skill sets would offer increasing range of services, like bicycle repair and hairstyling. Somehow, bags of rice from aid shipments found their way into the market stalls, and people were glad to buy this most valued commodity when they could, despite the specific specific ban on selling rice. In fact, as the Jiangmadan expansion was going into the late 1990s, aside from the original garden vegetables, the whole thing was illegal. But there was nothing the government could do about it, since there was no alternative that could put food on people's tables. Beginning sometime around 2002, the DPRK leadership made legal recognition of the market's official policy. Vendors could receive approval to operate in exchange for a fee. For large sellers, this licensure was worth the cost, and they no longer needed to fear arrest or seizure of their merchandise. The receipts also provided the dead broke state with a source of revenue. By the mid-2010s, the largest of the markets had become veritable superstores, with stalls spread over many acres, and products and services ranging from electronics, household appliances, motorcycles, car batteries, pharmaceuticals, and eventually even livestock. From the start, most of the vendors were middle-aged and older women, for a variety of reasons. Men have always made up the large majority of North Korea's military, which is huge. As a side note, it's among the world's largest fighting forces. Only China, the US, India, and possibly Russia have more soldiers and sailors, and all three have vastly larger populations and economies. De facto male conscription applies to the large majority of men, whereas only 1/10 as many women are recruited. In the 1990s, the standard term of military service grew to 10 years, and with grim job perspectives elsewhere, joining and staying in the army was for many young men the best deal on offer. Culturally, buying and selling goods was viewed as an undesirable job, and in the 1980s and 90s, women continued to have lower social status than men in North Korea. Additionally, food insecurity tends to kill adult men faster than adult women, based on natural body fat percentages. And in 2015, Kim Jong-un removed age restrictions on women marketers, while banning men under 60 from operating stalls. One result of markets run largely by women is a general rise in opportunity, a greater economic centrality for women in the income of families. Most people in the civilian sector still had day jobs, and those were still with the government. But by the early 2000s, most jobs paid far less than one needed to survive. This fact led to a second major economic restructuring. The reality was that you would likely have to make your living doing something other than your official job. Depending upon where you lived and your social standing, that could take various forms. By now, the state was effectively mandating that people grow their own food. Even soldiers spent a good deal of their time farming. If you were already working on a collective farm, you might sneak off to some marginal land to grow your own crops on the side. At first, this practice was likewise illegal, but utterly rational if you were looking at starvation as the alternative. In time, the government eased up on this issue too, allowing farm workers to cultivate some land for their own families, as long as they also hit their public quota. On a larger scale, people in positions of power began to start quasi-private companies. At a time when productivity couldn't be lower, managers were given permission to get creative in making money. International trade, particularly with China, became an important source of revenue for several government departments. Although the use of foreign currency was, as with so many other aspects of this new economy, illegal, in reality everyone knew that you needed Japanese yen, US dollars, and Chinese yuan to effectively keep operations moving. Around 2009, the DPRK made one last serious attempt to curtail privatization of the economy. The North Korean government effectively devalued their currency, which, like South Korea's, is called the won, although they're completely separate. The act of re-denominating North Korea's currency wiped out the savings of many of the newly minted black market success stories and was incredibly unpopular among this increasingly prominent class. The government backpedaled and ended its last serious crackdown on the informal economy. The official in charge of that monetary scheme was executed. It's an open secret that an official caste system determines much of your lot in life in the DPRK. Everyone is classified into one of three major strata, called songbon. Basically, people are considered either loyal, indifferent, or hostile to the regime. That sounds straightforward enough, but it gets worse. Songbon is inherited. If your parents had low status, you do too. Nobody tells you, but you figure it out. For example, you might ace an entrance exam into a university but get shut out. If you're a young woman, a guy you like might avoid you for fear of losing status. Because although you can't quite get yourself into a higher songbon, if the government finds out you're doing something questionable, you can get knocked to a lower level. At the highest social strata, you're exempted from military service and more or less guaranteed a high-status job. On the other hand, people at the very lowest status aren't trusted with much of anything and can't even qualify for military service. The majority majority of males do have to enlist, with evaluations starting around age 14 and training for those accepted beginning at age 17. There are minimum height and weight requirements too, but in the wake of an era of widespread malnutrition, those rules have necessarily been loosened. Going to university lets you defer enlistment, and depending upon the job you get out of college, you might be able to avoid the draft altogether. But again, university acceptance is partly based on your social class, and even more so, the course of your study you might enter. Party membership is likewise a function of your songbun. And so, in another irony, there aren't any members of the working class in the Korean Workers' Party. In principle, this has something to do with the supposed class standing of your ancestors in the pre-independence era, but those alleged justifications have no relationship at all to the power structure of the last 3 generations. High-status jobs as scientists, doctors, university professors, government officials, and the like require high songbun. On the other hand, in the world of the informal economy, class standing has much less importance. True, to manage one of the new major corporate enterprises, you have to start off in a position of wealth or power, but to succeed at the level of the Zhangmadang, you pretty much just have to hustle and probably pay some bribes. A natural offshoot of marketing homegrown produce is selling your home-cooked food. To the extent that ingredients were available, preparing food for sale at a Zhangmadang was a logical cottage industry, as was the bulk processing of raw ingredients like flour to fill the niche left by the shuttered state apparatus. At home, manufacturing of everyday products like shoes met other desperate needs for one's neighbors, and increasingly once unavailable imported foods like oranges and pineapples started showing up at the markets. The famine was ending for 2 reasons, one grim and the other hopeful. First, after so many deaths, there were just fewer mouths to feed. But now, there was also a functioning system in place to produce and distribute food. Although it involved risk, there wasn't much left to lose. One of the key elements of the informal economy is smuggling. The border with South Korea is ridiculously well guarded, so that's a non-starter. But the Chinese border to the north is pretty porous, if you know how and where to cross. In the modern system, border guards effectively count on bribes from smugglers as a major part of their salary. All manner of product pours in. Foreign fashions are quite popular, as are South Korean films and TV shows. As memory sticks replace DVDs as the medium of choice for banned content, censors are increasingly unable to stem the flow. Even soldiers in North Korea enjoy watching South Korean movies, albeit discreetly. Young women in the northern region have taken to wearing black jeans, which are less obvious than blue jeans, if technically still illegal. South Korean brands are more highly valued than Chinese, in another upending of the traditional party line. Millions of North Koreans own cell phones on the country's own internal network, but if you live near the border and want to talk to people outside the country, you can buy an illegal Chinese phone and pick up their signal from across the river. Increasingly, people are finding ways to communicate outside the eyes of the censors. The state puts limits on domestic travel, and you're supposed to get permission before going on a trip. That's become less of an obstacle now that there are so many private bus and truck operators. Since trains are unreliable almost to the point of being non-existent in much of the country, the new buses are about the only option anyway. A second and even more important function of these vehicles is the transportation of goods, licit or otherwise, around the country for distribution in a thriving markets. As with much of the economy, this system depends upon greased palms. Bribes have become so much a part of daily life that they've effectively become more of a system of taxation than any real threat of punishment for low-level economic crimes. Lower officials, in turn, have to hand some of their take up the ladder. At the bottom of the system, small vendors who operate at the margins of the official markets or in unofficial rural sites sometimes don't even bother to bribe anyone. When Kim Jong-un came to power in 2011, he revised his father's military first position to a new dual focus, basically nuclear weapons and the economy. These were at odds, since the sanctions from the international community in response to North Korea's nuclear weapons program were a drain on civilian sector development. But the new Kim also took a much more tolerant stance toward unofficial privatization. By now, entire government agencies were themselves profiting from capitalist enterprises, and the fact that this was in large part black market activity somewhat insulated them from international censure. There was never an official declaration, but cues from prominent officials displaying rich clothes and cars were a tacit invitation to increasing boldness from the nouveau rich. Pyongyang had a way to go, but the DPRK leadership clearly wanted it to compete with the luster of Seoul. Massive building projects in the capital became a priority. Lately, Kim Jong-un has made the development of resorts in the mountains and by the sea the focus of a huge push, since tourism is a sector less affected by international sanctions. If all this is starting to sound like the bad times may be ending, that's not quite the case, at least so far. The labor for the ambitious construction projects is effectively slavery. One of the major functions of the military is to serve as free construction labor. The hours are long and the work is brutally hard and sometimes unsafe. Food is meager, although it seems to be better than what soldiers on other bases are given to eat, which is nothing. Officers receive meals, although their families do not. Common soldiers are expected to grow their own food, or failing that, to forage. This creates bad relations with people in neighboring towns, since the resulting practice is for soldiers to steal from civilian homes. Recently, soldiers have crossed the border to go on looting trips to nearby villages in China. In one extreme case, a soldier who was seriously ill fled on foot across the demilitarized zone to South Korea, taking multiple gunshots in the process. Women in the North Korean military have found institutionalized rape and sexual abuse from higher-ranking officers and political advisors. An officially announced crackdown has yet to end this ugly variation on the culture of kickbacks and extortion. The harsh conditions faced by rank-and-file military are another inversion from the past, when that sector was the most valued part of the state. One exception to the trend is the group called Bureau 121, an elite group of hackers in the military, chosen young for special computer training and tasked with cyber warfare. This capability is considered especially important, and so its soldiers are well compensated. Being a civilian doesn't necessarily exempt you from forced labor. To support the rapid building campaigns, military-style shock troops of ordinary citizens are also pressed into service through levels of coercion. Regular industries have a chain of command akin to military structure, with employees belonging to fixed work groups. The units serve various purposes: disseminating official information, enforcing ideological conformity or at least lip service to it, and of course meeting production quotas. The workgroup bosses therefore can pretty much order people to join the ad hoc construction crews, regardless of whether the group is ostensibly doing construction elsewhere, operating machinery in a factory, or any other work. If you can afford a bribe, you can avoid heading out to the months-long construction project. To fill the shortfall created by those who can dodge conscription into a work gang, managers are reportedly going to extreme measures, including child labor. Food insecurity has begun looming again as a possible catastrophe. The government's agricultural department is more aware now of what should be done to prevent it, namely better crop yields through fertilizer and farm equipment. But that doesn't change the fact that needed infrastructure is still lacking. Lots of people still plow their fields walking behind an ox. Meager resources by definition prevent a stockpile of grain for an emergency, so the nation stumbles on hand to mouth year by year. General supply shortages have lately been hurting businesses in the neighborhood markets. Many people aren't willing to wait around to see how it turns out this time. A steady stream of defectors make their way out of North Korea every year. To do so requires not only the emotional investment of leaving your home, but a substantial pile of cash as well. So the people who are in the best positions to leave are not the desperately poor, but those who have managed to save some earnings from opportunities in the informal economy. The kind of human smuggling assistance you get varies depending upon your budget. A basic fee gets you across the border, and from there you have to find your way to Mongolia or Vietnam, and from there back around to South Korea. High-end smugglers will plan a complete itinerary for you with the necessary connections and bribes along the way to allow for a much shorter trip. South Korea welcomes all defectors from the north, and there are programs that help you get started in your new life. It won't be totally unknown since you've been watching South Korean TV for years and receiving quiet intel from trusted associates back home. And then the cycle can perpetuate itself. There's of course no official way to send money from south of the DMZ, but a substitute banking system allows defectors to send quite a bit of money back to North Korea, relative to the small size of the economy. Chinese nationals living in the DPRK are often helpful in this regard, while North Korean citizens near the northern border have to be somewhat discreet when using a Chinese cell phone. Chinese citizens can use the foreign phones openly. They'll get a call from a colleague in South Korea, transfer the amount paid by the sender, less a transaction fee, into their own account, and hand cash to the recipient. A similar system aids phone calls between the countries, reinforcing the growing information flow from person to person about the outside world. But despite cracks in the information wall, the totalitarian regime of the DPRK remains firmly in power with no sign of going anywhere. Political dissent is entirely forbidden and severely punished. As high-ranking officials grow rich off of bribes and the tier below them enter an upper middle class, their best bet is with the status quo. After all, it's the tacit government tolerance of the unofficial economic system that's gotten them where they are, both in terms of social rank and business opportunities. Backlashes against individuals are always always a possibility. Despite a trend toward freer dress codes, a prominent Pyongyang resident who crosses the invisible line into something too showy may face reprisal. And for more serious perceived political offenses, sentences of hard labor, prison, and execution remain common. So for now, North Koreans live out an inherent contradiction. They have to obey the law and voice support for a broken economic system, but they can only survive by working outside of it. An American journalist is sitting in a hectic newsroom trying to come up with a headline for his latest story. He's well aware that just a few days ago, on October 3, 2022, residents of Hokkaido, Japan looked into the sky and heard an intermediate-range ballistic missile flying overhead. One of them later said, "You can't ever get used to that sound." The journalist then writes, "North Korea is an imminent threat," with the subheading, "Recent missile tests should worry everyone." What the hell is going on in that strange and secretive country? Indeed, North Korea has upped the ante of late when it comes to testing its nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. A record has been set. Being as secretive as it is, we can't be sure how many nuclear weapons North Korea has, but it's thought to be around 30 to 40. According to experts, the bad news is that it has enough material to make another 6 of them every year. Before we tell you why you ought to be very concerned with what's happening, let us explain a few things. North Korea was thinking about building such weapons as far back as the 1950s, although it wasn't until the 60s that it started its nuclear program. It asked the Soviet Union for help, but received the reply, "Nah." It also asked China and again was snubbed. But the Soviet Union said, "Well, we can throw you a few of our top scientists and they'll help you build the facilities so you can have a nuclear energy program." This wasn't about weapons, just nuclear energy. Why not? It wasn't as if North Koreans were bathing in electricity back then, as they're not now. Then in the 1980s, North Korea took things a little bit further. It centered not just on making energy to light up its often potholed streets, but on building weapons of mass destruction. This wasn't great news for the USA, a country North Koreans were taught it was the epitome of evil. Folks would watch reels of outlandish propaganda on their TVs daily and be told in no uncertain terms that the US intended to ruin their outstandingly tremendous society. But on December 12, 1985, North Korea signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Later, the International Atomic Energy Agency read a report handed to it by North Korea and proceeded to do some inspections. The agency said something didn't feel right, accusing North Korea of inconsistencies, and then saying it believed the country wasn't telling the truth about how much plutonium it had. In 1993, North Korea told the agency it wouldn't allow a special inspection. This didn't look good in the area of global politics. The country almost pulled out of the treaty, although reversed that decision at the 11th hour. Things didn't get much better in the years ahead, with the US often accusing North Korea of not being upfront about its nuclear ambitions. In 2002, Pakistan told the world that North Korea had already used its nuclear technology for years. By this time, the US had already imposed sanctions on North Korea, warning there'd be more to come if it didn't start doing as it was told. And it didn't. Then, in 2006, boom. North Korea detonated its first bomb, albeit underground. It became the 8th country in the world to do such a thing. Americans quivered when they read the headlines. Some people got into hate mode when they read that the most unstable and most dangerous country in the world was now capable of causing a right old mess. Even China condemned North Korea, as did the United Nations Security Council, after which a bunch more sanctions were laid down. These were mostly about various materials that could be used to make weapons of mass destruction, but the UN even put sanctions on luxury goods. This was mostly to antagonize North Korea's elites, who loved fine whiskey and other pretty goods made in the wretched, capitalistic West. Those same elites told the US and other leading powers that it needed nuclear weapons to ensure its survival. And anyway, they said, if you've got them, why shouldn't we have them? North Korea was already regarded as an odd country that refused to play ball on the world stage, but 2006 made it even more estranged from Western powers. Maybe some of you remember the time when just about every day there was another news article about the threat of North Korea. The trigger-happy president of the US, George Bush, said a new era had dawned. He said President Kim Jong-il, the so-called ever-victorious iron-willed commander, was enemy number 1. Well, he was in the top 3 at least. The eternal president wasn't as eternal as some people had imagined, though. He died in 2011 from a heart attack. The North Korean media said that when he went, a raging snowstorm just stopped, and the sky glowed red. A thick ice of a lake ostensibly cracked open and shook the heavens and the earth. After all, this was a man with out-of-this-world powers. The first time he ever played golf, he got a 38 under par, a score that would have made Tiger Woods envious. The Korean people didn't hear about Kim Jong-il's fondness for rich food. They weren't told about his $800,000 a year cognac habit, or that chain smoking isn't great for a man's heart. The new supreme leader replaced him, Kim Jong-un. The question was, would relations with Western powers get any better under him? In 2007, North Korean leaders had met with representatives from South Korea, China, Russia, Japan, and the United States. They said North Korea would scrap its nuclear ambitions and close its nuclear facilities. And then, in 2009, boom, another bomb was detonated. But in 2012, under this new great leader, North Korea said there was no way it would conduct any more nuclear tests. The US said, okay, we've heard this one before. North Korea held out a metaphorical pinky finger and said it would do what it said this time. And it said, come and inspect our sites. We welcome you with open arms. The US said, okay, if that's the case, we might even send you some food aid. Then, less than a year later, boom! This was boom number 3. It was another test that happened underground. It was a big boom, too. South Korea said it might have been around 6 to 7 kilotons of TNT, but Japan said it was more likely 8 to 10 kilotons. Germany said 40 kilotons, but on revision, said more like 14. The US said something along the lines of, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Relations were certainly not improving. They got worse in 2016 when another test happened. This time, North Korea said it was not a uranium or plutonium device, but a much more devastating hydrogen bomb. Some experts questioned this, but no one questioned the fact North Korea was telling the truth when it said the test was an act of self-defense regarding the threat of the USA. News channels in North Korea told the people that the US was acting hostile and had time and time again been slanderous in criticizing human rights abuses that they swore hadn't happened. A North Korean newsreader said, it is just to have H-bomb as self-defense against the US having numerous and humongous nuclear weapons. The DPRK's fate must not be protected by any forces but the DPRK itself. We guess you're starting to see a pattern here. North Korea gets friendly, everyone shakes hands, North Korea does another test, then the US, EU, and most other countries condemn the test. This happened again later in 2016, after North Korea conducted its biggest test, thought to produce a yield of 20 kilotons. The North Korean government proudly announced that it had tested a nuclear warhead that had been standardized to be able to be mounted on a strategic ballistic rocket. South Korea wasn't happy at all, saying the North's act was pretty much self-destruction. And Japan, another neighbor, was less than pleased. The country said North Korea had just become a graver threat to Japan's safety. In fact, no one really was on North Korea's side. Both China and Russia said, come on, North Korea, give it up, will ya? It didn't help matters that North Korea bragged that it could produce at will as many as it wants, a variety of smaller, lighter, and diversified nuclear warheads of higher strike power, and use them with ballistic rockets. As for Japan's relationship with North Korea back then, you could compare it to the relationship between a cat named Tom and a mouse named Jerry. The friction goes back a long way, but got much worse when North Korea started testing nuclear weapons. In fact, a poll by the BBC revealed that the Japanese public had a more negative view of North Korea than any country in the world. After that last 2016 test, relations have never been as bad. Then in 2017, President Donald Trump condemned North Korea after discovering the country had conducted an intercontinental ballistic missile test. CNN wrote, the missile was launched from Mupyeong-ni and traveled about 1,000 kilometers before splashing down in the waters off the Japanese coast, according to the Pentagon. Trump said that U.S. would support Japan and South Korea if anything bad should happen. South Korea noted that the missile was more advanced than others that had been tested in the past. U.S. intelligence said there was little doubt that North Korea would soon have a reliable, nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile. Nonetheless, no one knew exactly just what North Korea was capable of. Sure, they could guess, but even with the tests, it still wasn't certain what kind of world-wrecking potential the country had. In 2017, things became clearer. North Korea launched 4 ballistic missiles toward the Sea of Japan. Japan was enraged, and it seemed North Korea didn't care. At one point, North Korea called Japan's leader an imbecile and political dwarf. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but nuclear warheads will really harm you, is the expression that comes to mind. Later that year, North Korea announced that it had conducted a perfect hydrogen bomb test. This was 10 times more powerful than anything else it had tested, and perhaps more than 250 kilotons. Soon after, Trump re-enlisted North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. Things then went a little quiet. The next 2 years didn't see headlines featuring North Korean nuclear tests. Still, U.S. intelligence said it might be quiet out there, but North Korea was busy making a lot more weapons. It just wasn't testing them. Then in 2020, news clips showed North Korea wheeling out what the Western press said was possibly the world's largest liquid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile. Ouch! This might not have been tested, but soon experts in the West were saying this thing could carry out a number of nuclear warheads and travel a long, long way. Looked bigger than anything North Korea had come up with in the past, with U.S. analysts saying it likely had the potential to hit the U.S. mainland. Kim Jong-un got on a podium and to his adoring fans stated, "We will continue to strengthen war deterrence as a means of self-defense. Our war deterrence will never be abused or used preemptively, which will contribute to protecting the sovereignty and survival of the country and pursuing regional peace. However, if anyone hurts the national safety or threatens to use military force against us, I will preemptively mobilize all of our strongest offensive forces to punish them. Ouch again. But then there was a period of quiet again. Maybe North Korea had settled down a bit to deal with the pandemic, although as usual, the country wasn't exactly forthcoming when it comes to providing data. We do know it started a vaccine program, although when the leader talked about 1 million cases, he said fever, not explaining what kind of fever. During the era of lockdowns and attendant mayhem, it doesn't seem North Korea was in the testing mood. Then came 2022, the year of records. It started by testing a bunch of weapons at what the media said was a frantic pace. This included the test of a hypersonic glide vehicle, what CNN called potentially one of the most powerful weapons on the planet. But North Korea wasn't done there. It also tested an intermediate-range ballistic missile and some cruise missiles. Then, to put some icing on an already explosive cake, North Korea declared in September it was officially a nuclear weapons state, and there was about as much chance of denuclearizing as the USA outright banning public ownership of high-powered firearms. After hearing about North Korea's volley of tests, you could hear a great big sigh from the less war-supporting segments of the US public, each admitting to themselves that peace in our time and less money spent on arms was pretty much out of the question now. The other part of the USA was screaming USA, USA, with the addition of nuke those bleepers. Meanwhile, North Korean websites were printing news that might have made its own nationals say something similar. You could read such things as, currently the U.S. nuclear aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan Strike Group is conducting a joint naval maneuver exercise against us in the high seas of the East Sea of Korea with South Korean puppet naval ships. In North Korea, there's only one truth, and that's usually a pack of lies, or at least some truth dressed up in a fair amount of extreme bias. On one website alone, just this month, there must be 20 stories of other countries congratulating the supreme leader on what great standout chap he is. You can look at a review on another website of a movie called The Day Before. The film's summary goes, the Japanese imperialists map out the plan of the Sakura operation to destroy a whole city before their defeat. A recent documentary film called Outcry of Mothers is summarized. It depicts the historical facts of the hot-blooded outcry of souls massacred cruelly by the US imperialists and class enemies. They cry out for revenge on the US imperialists at the cost of blood. You get the drift. This was why most people in North Korea might forego a meal or two, knowing that those expensive weapons will ensure their safety from the infinitely nasty Japanese and American imperialists. Another website explained that one of the most recent tests was to send a severe warning to the enemy. The story said the US had been conducting threatening military exercises in the Korean peninsula, which it said was an open threat and created heightened tension in the area. The story added, for this reason it was decided to organize and proceed with practical military exercises of various levels. The respected comrade Kim Jong was said to have been very pleased with the launches. He told the nation that they had the nuclear capabilities to defend the country. The tests, said the story, only happened because of the continuous, intentional, irresponsible, aggravating actions of the US and South Korean regimes that provoke a greater response from us. So there you have it. That's the North Korean tale of the tape. The website also said that if the US keeps messing about in the Korean peninsula, we can expect more tests or even worse. Over in the US, President Joe Biden's administration already had its hands full with what's been going on in Ukraine. And as one person said, Biden is presently showing no fire and no fury in regard to North Korea. He is apparently open to talking it over with the supreme leader, perhaps over some diplomatic kimchi burgers. Some US hardliners think Biden should stick it to Pyongyang, but then some hardliners don't always look like they understand what nuclear war means, whether in Europe or Asia. We aren't going to criticize anyone today, we're just here to understand what North Korea is up to. It seems the country isn't telling fibs when it says the US has been doing a few military exercises in the Korean peninsula, so have Japan and South Korea, which obviously makes the North Koreans a bit nervous. The New York Times wrote, North Korea is frustrated, isolated, and uncertain about its future. God knows what Americans would think if North Korea started doing its own military exercises in the Atlantic. But another reason for the tests is the sanctions. When Trump was sitting in the big chair, North Korea tried to use its nuclear capabilities to leverage to try to get the US to lift sanctions, but it never worked out. Maybe North Korea is now thinking if it does a few more tests, and big ones at that, the US might consider lifting those sanctions. Some analysts are now saying North Korea might actually step down from having longer-range missile capabilities if the US lifts the sanctions and makes life easier over there. This is mere speculation. Also, remember that North Korea has been a bit tricky in the past. What is certain, though, is the North Korean people will be behind their leader whatever happens. They might have been taught Clockwork Orange style that the US is evil and wants to destroy them. You might have heard something similar about North Korea, but let's face it, you had the choice to read different takes on that. They don't. With this in mind, you can bet your bottom dollar that North Koreans won't be asking their leaders anytime soon to back down from all that aggression. It also has to be said, there are certain factions in the US that seem to bristle with anger every time they hear about North Korea. You can't say North Koreans have nothing to fear. Try being in their heads when the next military exercise happens close to them. Then again, South Koreans are also understandably shaken. As for the Japanese people, when they hear about North Korea testing weapons that travel longer and longer distances, of course they get upset. The BBC recently talked to an analyst about a test who said this is the longest range missile it's ever fired over Japan. It could be a precursor to testing another nuclear warhead, which has been predicted for some time. The Japanese know more than anyone about the destructiveness of nuclear weapons. People have family and relatives who lived in Japan when a 15-kiloton nuclear bomb hit Hiroshima and another bomb hit Nagasaki. Now these people are reading that North Korea has a similar weapon that could have a yield between 100 and 370 kilotons. It seems some negotiating needs to be done. It feels like a bit of good old-fashioned diplomacy needs to happen. But one problem with this is that the US is not quite on the same terms with Russia and China as it was when the three countries agreed in the past on the North Korean nuclear problem. And if we try and take a North Korean point of view, what do the people think when they hear that Japan and South Korea have drastically increased nuclear spending of late, with the US supplying city-wrecking arms to the latter? The New Statesman just wrote that South Korea's new leader always planned to take a harder line on North Korea. That might not sound great if you live north of the border. Is it really surprising that North Korea is conducting these tests? We think not. What's worrying is some people are talking about a dangerous cycle of escalation, and China and Russia closing ranks with Kim Jong-un. We, the people, need some grown-ups in that room that prevent this cycle from happening. To think that the big wigs of the world cannot agree to avoid mutually assured destruction sounds like madness on steroids. But then look at what happened at the start of the 20th century. It seems a lot of backing down from every side needs to happen, and fast. Otherwise, historians in the future might be talking about the utter stupidity of those reckless savages that almost brought down the human race as half the public was filming it on TikTok. The bloodiest conflict of the 21st century starts out quiet enough. A few dozen street cleaners across Seoul go about their business, spraying pesticide and disinfectant spray on the sidewalks and bushes around the most popular and important businesses and cultural sites of Seoul. There are few people out early this morning, and the sun's just starting to rise. But within 2 hours, the South Korean capital will be swarming with almost 10 million people and an additional 1 million tourists. By noon, 500,000 will be dead. The street cleaners are North Korean agents who snuck across the border months ago, loaded up with backpacks and sprayers full of various chemical and biological agents. Going about their business largely ignored by authorities, the sprayers have infected several square kilometers of one of Asia's most important cities, and the highly contagious agents have reached millions of people in the span of a few hours. The chemical agents are more immediately lethal nerve agents, which target the brain's ability to send signals to the various organs in the body. Hundreds of thousands seize up, paralyzed, and unable to breathe as they slowly asphyxiate. Medical services are immediately overwhelmed and far too late to save most victims. The biological agents the North Korean sleeper agents have spread across Seoul will take longer to take their toll. These include anthrax, hemorrhagic fever, yellow fever, smallpox, and plague. Highly virulent, those affected will spread diseases across the rest of the population, and in days, the death toll will reach in the millions. The attack on Seoul is repeated across South Korea's major cities, especially Busan, a strategic important city for the U.S. defense of South Korea. Agents attempt to infect U.S. and South Korean bases, but these have environmental systems which immediately alert authorities to the attack. It's not enough to stop all casualties, but it does severely limit the effects of the attack. By the time it's obvious that North Korea has struck the first blow, the second terrible blow falls square on Seoul itself. Hundreds of long-range guns open up on the South Korean capital from behind the demilitarized zone. They're joined by over 1,000 rocket projectors, creating a literal rain of steel that falls down on the densely populated city. Every minute, an astonishing 10,000 high-explosive rounds fall on the city. These casualties are immediate and immense, with nearly 1 million people dying in the first hour of the attack. But not all of those incoming rounds are conventional. Thousands of VX gas munitions explode in the skies all over Seoul, spreading the incredibly lethal agent throughout the city. Long-range missiles loaded up with VX, smallpox, and other biological agents are fired by the hundreds at other South Korean cities and military bases. The U.S. bases of Osan and Kunsan come under direct attack from conventional, chemical, and biological weapons. But U.S.-made Patriot missile batteries succeed in destroying many of the older generation missiles, targeting those critically important bases. A few manage to slip through, but the damage is limited by the fact that U.S. troops are vaccinated against anthrax, smallpox, and various other biological agents. South Korean Korean forces, however, are not, and attacks against the South Korean military are far more deadly. US and South Korean warplanes are attempting to take to the air, but North Korean special forces have launched daring raids against most major airfields. At Osan and Kunsan, the North Korean Special Forces soldiers launched suicidal raids against the American planes stationed there. U.S. security forces manage a robust defense, but the attacks still managed to destroy or damage many high-value American aircraft, and even more importantly, slow down air operations significantly. With planes in the air within minutes of the shelling of Seoul, though, an immediate hunt for North Korea's deadliest weapons is on. American and South Korean warplanes scream across the border and into North Korea. American and South Korean F-15s and F-16s clash with waves of antiquated North Korean MiGs. It's a complete turkey shoot for the American and South Korean air forces, but the sheer number of defenders slow them from their ultimate objective, the destruction of North Korea's nuclear weapons. From Japan and operational bases in South Korea, American special forces are being rushed to the north with one job: seize North Korean nuclear sites before the weapons stored there can be used. But they're not the only ones trying to get to North Korea's nukes. China has been monitoring the situation in the Korean peninsula closely, and for a few years has had an elite cadre of special forces deployed near its border with the North. At the outbreak of hostilities, Chinese special forces board helicopters and fly at full speed toward their former ally. The orders are simple and clear: seize North Korea's nuclear weapons before they can be used, and kill any who stand in their way. But does that include American special forces attempting to do the same thing? Nobody knows, but what is clear is that with most of North Korea's nuclear sites within 60 miles of its border with China, the Chinese will likely get there first. But those efforts are moot at the moment as a dozen long-range ballistic missiles lift off from launch pads in the mountainous north. The world holds its breath as the missiles streak up and into the sky, breaking through the atmosphere. It was once believed that Kim Jong-un would only use nuclear weapons as a last resort, but recently it's become clear he was willing to use them in the opening stages of a conflict. His gambit is simple: force the United States to rethink its willingness to defend South Korea. To achieve his goals, the missiles are aimed at the American air bases in Osan and Kunsang, and the port city of Busan, and several other South Korean cities. A final missile is aimed straight at the US's base in Guam. Despite having the capability of striking at the US homeland, Kim Jong-un has decided not to. An explicit message to the American president: is he willing to trade Los Angeles for Seoul by defending South Korea in this war? American terminal high-altitude defense systems target the North Korean missiles in their terminal phase, while offshore Aegis-equipped South Korean and American destroyers lend their own missile defense support. Working in tandem, the missile defense of the South manages to stop 8 of the missiles. 4 hit their mark. The American air base in Osan goes up in nuclear fire, as does the port city of Busan and 2 other metropolitan centers. The missile aimed at Guam is intercepted by the island fortress's robust missile defenses, but the message is clear: Kim is willing to use nukes against distant American targets, to include the homeland. The loss of Busan is especially damaging for the US's plans to defend the South. The port city is the only major port where the U.S. would be able to disembark the large number of troops and combat material needed to defeat the North. While the U.S. has 30,000 troops in South Korea, it's estimated that it will need at least 200,000 to end the threat of the Kim regime once and for all. Even as the North's nuclear missiles are falling in the South, the air war against North Korea has already devastated much of its nuclear infrastructure and command and control nodes. Despite this, fully eliminating North Korea's nuclear capabilities will require a ground invasion with conventional forces, even with special operations forces inserted into the north within hours of the conflict starting in earnest. These American troops have run into stiff resistance from North Korean defenders, and in some places have made contact with Chinese special forces that beat them there. Washington is perfectly fine with Beijing gaining control of North Korea's nukes, so a conflict between the two sides is averted. However, North Korea has prepared to defend its nuclear weapons from both China and the US, and not all insertions to seize its nuclear sites have gone to plan. American and Chinese units have been completely decimated at several key locations, overwhelmed by North Korean defenders. After a blistering barrage of nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks against military facilities and civilian targets alike, air operations are having difficulty meeting the sortie rates required to check the North Korean advance across the DMZ. The United States is surging air forces from Japan into the battle, and everyone's surprised Japan has officially joined the fight. Its long-range strike capabilities are quite limited though, and instead for now the Japanese Air Force aids in establishing air superiority and providing close air support for ground units engaged in fierce combat. The North's forces have poured across the minefields and barricades of the DMZ like a massive human wave. The casualties have absolutely been staggering, but with well over 1 million men to throw at the South, those losses have been easily absorbed by the gargantuan North Korean military. American and South Korean border units fight fiercely, but are overwhelmed by the unrelenting assault. The mass concentration of North Korean artillery has suffered significant losses during its shelling of Seoul to counter battery fire and airstrikes. But the sheer number of guns deployed by the North still give it blistering firepower with which to batter the South's defenders. Losses along the South's line units are incredible, and despite having superior equipment, training, and firepower, the South's much smaller army is being steadily pushed back towards Seoul by the end of the first day of fighting. Night slows down the North's advance, as many of its troops and vehicles lack night vision equipment or thermal imaging. Now is the chance for the South to strike back, and U.S. and South Korean attack helicopters and armor units launch a brutal counterattack against the North's forces. The U.S. only operates a token force of tanks in South Korea, about 50 at any one time, but the big Abrams easily outmatch and outgun any of the Cold War-era tanks the North has to offer. Fighting alongside South Korean K-2 tanks, despite being vastly outnumbered, the South's defenders inflict catastrophic losses on the North over a night of firefighting. It's not enough, and thanks to its massive artillery forces, the North manages to inflict large losses of its own on the American and South Korean armor units. The bombing of North Korea has been non-stop since the beginning of the conflict. Massive American B-52s drop hundreds of thousands of pounds of ordnance on the North's advance into the South. But flying from bases in Japan and Guam, their sortie rates are very low. Additional B-52s and B-1s are being surged from the U.S. mainland and European theater, but they'll likely take a few days to be operational. B-2 stealth bombers, however, have been flying from the U.S. mainland overnight, refueled by aerial tankers. They slip through North Korean radar en route to deliver surgical strikes against North Korean political and military targets. Armed with massive ground-penetrating bunker-buster munitions, the B-2s deliver a crippling strike on key North Korean facilities. But the plan to decapitate the North Korean government with one swift strike fails. Kim Jong-un has survived the attack, and intelligence is spotty on where exactly the North Korean leader is. Notably, though, the B-2s are not armed with nuclear weapons. It seems, despite the threat to Guam and successful strikes against a U.S. airbase in South Korean cities, the United States is not willing to escalate up the nuclear ladder. With the aid of U.S. air power, the South's forces are able to halt the North Korean advance just past Seoul. The once vibrant capital is now a post-apocalyptic wasteland, with millions dead in the streets and most of its infrastructure utterly destroyed by a bombardment the scale of which has never been seen in human history. Millions more have survived and are now in desperate need of food, water, and medical care, but the North is not interested in meeting the needs of a captured civilian population. Instead, in order to prevent the spread of diseases they themselves infected the city with, a brutal quarantine has been put into effect around every entry port into the city, and any violators immediately shot on sight and their bodies burned. The international community requests that the North Korean government allow humanitarian flights into the city to treat survivors and evacuate the population, but with China now considered a mortal enemy of the Kim regime, there is no nation with the logistical capability to undertake such a massive operation that the North isn't at war with or trusts. The survivors of Seoul have now become a bargaining chip for the North, which demands reunification with the South, but under its own terms. The situation is dicey for the democratic South, to say the least. While its forces, backed by massive amounts of American-era naval power, have checked the North's advance into their country, they're unable to push them back across the border. The plan was always for the South to act as a blocking force against the North long enough for the United States to surge combat troops into the nation. But with the port facilities at Busan devastated and other ports contaminated by biological or chemical attack, the offloading of large numbers of American troops and equipment, a proposition that would have normally required 6 weeks, will now take months. It could be as much as 4 months before the U.S. has enough forces in theater to drive the North out. The survivors of Seoul will not last 4 months. Within 3 weeks, uncontaminated food and water supplies will have run out, and disease will have killed tens of thousands more. In 2 months, the several million survivors trapped by North Korean forces will all be dead. American combat troops are even now being loaded into their fleet transport ships as air transport surge small amounts of forces into the country. But the ultimate choice is on the surviving South Korean government. Are they really willing to commit 5 million survivors in Seoul to death as they wait for their American allies? And are they willing to risk further nuclear attacks now that it's become clear the United States will not use nuclear weapons of its own in defense of South Korea? Two teenagers wake up in North Korea. One is the son of a high-ranking North Korean government official, the other is the son of an average citizen. Over the next 24 hours, their lives couldn't possibly be more different. The first teen wakes up in a luxurious apartment located in one of Pyongyang's newest high-rises. His father is a high-ranking official amongst the North Korean government, but not amongst the top 10% within the party who control nearly all the power and wealth in the nation. Still, by any standards, even Western ones, his father is very wealthy. And by North Korean standards, his family is among the richest in the nation. However, wealth isn't the only way to power in North Korea. And while his father is a rising star in the government, he still hasn't earned the privilege of living in the most wealthy residential districts of the capital city. For breakfast, our teen has his pick of a variety of foods. He could choose to have a traditional Korean breakfast which sort of resembles Spanish tapas. A variety of dishes which include grilled short ribs, spicy seafood salad, bean sprout rice, spicy stewed fish, cold cucumber soup, seasoned kelp, and radish strip kimchi. His family's kitchen staff has already made itself available by 5 a.m. to be ready to serve, given that his father often has to be at work by 6 a.m. Our teen has woken up at a modest 8 a.m. though. Despite his wealth, he is very much being groomed to join the halls of North Korean power and work his way up the ranks to hopefully surpass his father. That means that unlike most other wealthy North Korean kids, there's immense pressure on him and he's constantly scrutinized by party officials for any sign of weakness. Despite not having school today, sleeping in too late would be seen as a sign of laziness, and there's a good chance at least one member of the household staff is secretly spying on the family for more senior party officials. One must always have their guard up, even in their own home. Instead of traditional Korean breakfast, our teen opts for an American classic, Smacks. It's authentic Smacks cereal too, complete with the cartoon frog. While you'd be extremely hard-pressed to find legit American products anywhere else in the country, our teen's father is important enough to be able to access goods smuggled into North Korea through its various government-sponsored black market programs. Smacks cereal, Pop-Tarts, and other American treats are a favorite amongst North Korea's elite and a sign of status. Our second teen has already been awake for hours. He got up at 4 a.m. along with his father so they could both find a ride into the city. He lives on the outskirts of Pyongyang, and this is considered a privilege. This teen lives in one of a row of squat concrete homes built on the outskirts of the capital. His family has few belongings, and he shares a large sleeping mat in his room with his younger brother. The family doesn't own a car, and there's no formal public transportation on the extreme outskirts of the city, so the teen and his father must rise early to secure themselves a spot in a large utility van owned by another local. In exchange for ferrying as many people as he can fit into his van into the city, the man gets the equivalent of 75 cents per passenger. This is about 1/6 of what his father will earn today, but there's no other choice. In the evening, he and his father will likely be forced to make the 3-hour walk home. Despite the relative poverty our second teen lives in, his family is extremely lucky. Here on the outskirts of the capital city, his father is able to commute into the city and get a job as a doorman at one of the luxury apartment buildings. When his father was a teenager, such a thing would have been unthinkable, as the luxury apartment buildings were extremely scarce. Today, though, despite tough international sanctions, the North Korean economy has slightly improved. And while most of the benefit is for those at the very top, some of that wealth has trickled down to the rest. For those living outside of a major city, though, daily hunger and abject poverty are a continued reality. Our second teen is extremely lucky, and his parents make sure to tell him every day. Our second teen hopes to also secure a job as a doorman. He's only 15, but that's old enough to work in North Korea. He could opt to go to school, but entry into North Korean universities is all but impossible without the right connections or wealth. Most slots for new students are immediately taken up by the children of North Korea's elite. Just to earn a spot, one has to have exceptional school grades and then be nominated by a local college recommendation committee. If cleared by the committee, the applicant must then be approved by subsequent county and provincial level committees. Our teen was a good student, but the sheer number of hurdles to jump through to get to a university means he's more likely to make a living for himself by finding work in the city. He dreams of a doorman job or perhaps even getting accepted to work at one of the city's factories. For now, though, he hires himself out as a general laborer, picking up trash or sometimes even helping out at construction sites. If he's lucky, he may get a job as a builder, and the government might send him to work overseas. These types of contracts are common in construction across the Middle East and Asia, with North Korean laborers hired out by the government to construction companies. The government keeps most of what the contract is worth, but he can make as much as several dollars a day, a very good deal for him, even if the work conditions are often extremely brutal and tantamount to slave labor, as foreign companies can be extremely abusive to their North Korean laborers. Our first teen has finished his breakfast and has an hour to kill before his cultural enrichment classes begin. It's a Saturday, so he doesn't have to attend Kim Il-sung University where he's majoring in finance. Kim Il-sung University is the country's premier institution of higher learning, and admissions are extremely competitive. Only 1 in 6 applicants are accepted, and recommendations have to be ironclad. Luckily for our teen, his father has the right connections and the wealth to make the appropriate bribes. Despite not having official schooling today, he still takes various arts classes outside of his university requirements. Achieving status and power amongst North Korean elite is a careful game, and one must give off the appearance of being well-rounded, as well as having fierce dedication to the Kim regime. Thus, our teen takes a few hours of art classes on the weekends. He dresses in some of the West's latest fashions, yet another sign of his status. Most well-to-do North Koreans will be a season or 2 behind in fashion, as it's difficult to get items from Western markets into the nation. However, only the most elite remain on top of fashion trends and proudly display the fact as a status symbol. He also catches a bit of Western television. While the rest of the nation only enjoys North Korean government-sponsored programming and international communications and television are strictly banned, a perk of power is access to satellite television. Even just to access the regular internet, one has to have special permission from the government, while the rest of the nation enjoys a nationwide intranet run completely by the government. Our teen has enough time for 1 half-hour TV show before it's time to leave. He dislikes the plethora of Chinese TV channels available to him, all of them also heavily censored by their own government, and instead appreciates the uncensored content from Europe and the USA. One day, he might even continue his studies abroad, and he hopes to go to the United States to continue his education. Given the relationship between the two countries, it seems impossible, but his father has the connections to get him fake Chinese documents that should fool US Customs. Riding an elevator down to the lobby, a shiny new Mercedes and a driver are waiting to take him to his art class. The Mercedes is very luxurious, but a few years old, a sign that his father isn't yet among the top 1% of North Korean society, but very close nonetheless. These luxury vehicles are prohibited from being exported to the Hermit Kingdom, but the government has ways of smuggling them anyway, and owning a current-year luxury vehicle is the ultimate sign of power and status. Hopping into the air-conditioned vehicle, he's whisked away in total comfort for his 1-hour art class. A few blocks away, our second teen and his father have finally arrived at the city center. His father has to hurry to work. He's risking running late and losing his job, but the van has made more stops today than anticipated. He says goodbye to his father and heads in the opposite direction, looking for any public workers or construction sites who may need an extra hand for the day. If he finds nothing, he'll keep looking for the next 14 hours until his father is off work and the two head back home. He has no lunch money with him. He won't eat until he gets home tonight. The only meal he had before leaving home was some rice, soybean paste, and a few vegetables. Compared with people in the country, he's eating extremely well. Our first teen wraps up his art class. His teacher's from France, one of the few foreigners allowed into the country, let alone to teach. In return, he's paid extremely well, which makes his classes very expensive. Yet another sign of our teen's status. He sends a text to some friends over his cell phone. Cell phones were once banned in the country after an alleged assassination attempt on the Kim family, but those restrictions have been relaxed. Now you can enjoy 3G service, though again with no international internet, since the cell service is run by the government-controlled communications company. Koryo Link is the fastest service available, though Kumsan has larger coverage even if it's only 2G. Our first teen and his friends agree to meet up for lunch and drinks at the Taedonggang Brewery, famous for making domestic North Korean beer. Normally, one would have to make reservations, but our teen's father and the fathers of his friends are known to the brewery staff, and one phone call is all it takes to clear them for a table for lunch. The legal drinking age in North Korea is 18, but most places don't bother with enforcing that, despite some of our teen's friends only being 16 years old and none of the staff saying a word, and they wouldn't dare question the son or daughter of a high-ranking official anyway. Once there, they're served by pretty waitresses in form-fitting pink uniforms. At North Korea's elite social spots, a strong emphasis is placed on the wait and serving staff being attractive, fit, and young. Once a server ages out, they're replaced by a new, younger member. Being pretty and fit in North Korea's major cities can offer many opportunities to young women not available elsewhere, but those opportunities are often rife with abuse. The teens drink and eat, ordering Western fare such as burgers and even burritos. Enjoying American foods is yet another sign of privilege, and a growing number of establishments in major cities are pairing traditional Korean fare with American and Western dishes. Despite being allowed to drink, none of the teens drink to excess, as they're always under close scrutiny. Any major public incident could spell doom, not just for them, but their fathers' political futures as well. After lunch, the teens are driven to one of Pyongyang's amusement centers, featuring flashy arcades and even some carnival-style rides. There, they enjoy themselves playing North Korean versions of popular Western arcade games, but many are either blatantly pirated copies or simply smuggled into the country. A Led Zeppelin pinball machine sits next to a Jurassic World shooting simulator, and a bevy of treats and sugary drinks, both traditional and Western, are available to the teens. As the day grinds down, our teen returns home just in time to catch his father also arriving. The two take the elevator up and discuss their relative days, before entering the home to be greeted by their mother, who's already supervised the house staff in the preparation of a delicious meal. Tonight, dinner will be traditional with a Western-style twist. Braised short ribs and kimchi accompany a meaty beef lasagna dish. The family isn't stingy though, and what they don't eat, the house staff will take home to their families. These leftovers are still significantly more meat than the average North Korean will eat in a month. Our second teen's day is also coming to an end. He spent the entire morning until noon desperately looking for work, until finally he got lucky, and a construction site offered him work for the day. For 7 hours, he lugged heavy bricks up and down scaffolding, being allowed to rest only when there was a lull in the work. His hard work has paid off though, and despite being only 16, the foreman said he would consider the boy for an overseas job assignment. If he's lucky enough to receive it, he'll likely end up working in the exploding cities in the Middle East, where he'll work in 105+ degree weather with few breaks. The local management is known to be extremely abusive to their North Korean workers, doling out physical punishments as they see fit. After a 14 to 16-hour workday, he'll be immediately herded to a shared living quarter. Government minders will oversee his entire stay and not allow him any contact with the local population. For his work, he'll get an average salary of $12 a day, though the government will take at least half of that. Still, this would be an incredible opportunity for our teen as he and his father begin their 3-hour walk home. He looks with optimism toward his future. As far as killing its own citizens goes, the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea see eye to eye. Both these countries still have the death penalty. Their two systems are vastly different, and it's no secret that North Korea and the United States don't get along. Yet it's interesting to note that the death penalty is something both these countries have in common, even though most of the world has stopped using it for human rights reasons. As we examine death row in North Korea and the United States, there are many differences. There's also some similarities that might surprise you. Whether you agree with the death penalty or not, the fact remains both the United States of America and North Korea are 2 of 54 countries in the entire world that still use the death penalty. Just so we're clear, there are 141 countries that have outlawed the practice, so the US and North Korea are not in the majority. In 2020, Amnesty International recorded 483 executions in 18 countries. This means that although 54 countries may have the death penalty, they are not actually using it all the time. 2020 was a crazy year, but statistically there was a 26% decrease in executions from the previous year. China is still the world's leader in executions, but where do the United States and North Korea fall on this list? Due to the lack of data and information coming out of the DPRK, it's hard to say just how many executions happen per year. To be fair, the number will always be much higher than we think, because the government isn't held accountable to anyone but itself, so they can pretty much do whatever they want to its citizens. This includes making people disappear or killing them without cause. In a way, everyone in North Korea is on death row at all times. The United States, on the other hand, has a judicial system that allows for a fair trial. It's not a perfect system, and mistakes have been made in the past where people who were innocent have been executed, but at least there is some accountability. The US is also one of only 2 countries in the Americas that still has the death penalty, the other being Trinidad and Tobago. Although Trinidad and Tobago has not carried out an execution since 1979, the United States executed 17 people in the year 2020. This puts the US 6th on the list of the most executions in the last few years. The 5 countries ahead of the US are China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt. However, it's a pretty safe bet that if we had any data from North Korea, it would be pretty high on the list. It's currently unknown how many people there are on death row in North Korea or even how many people have been executed. These statistics are closely guarded by the North Korean government, and they refuse to release crime statistics of any kind. What we do know of death row in North Korea comes mostly from defectors, and unfortunately not many of them make it out of the country alive. The United States does release data around the number of people from death row executed each year. In 2020, the number of executions dropped from the previous year by over 20%. On October 1, 2020, there were 2,553 inmates on death row in the U.S. There seems to be a trend of less people being executed in the U.S. each year, but only time will tell if this will continue. Unlike in North Korea, the death penalty varies by state in the U.S. As of right now, there are 27 states that still use the death penalty. This means that in the remaining 23 U.S. states, the death penalty is illegal. In North Korea, 100% of the country is subject to the death penalty. You may be wondering what can send someone to death row in North Korea versus the U.S. The crimes that can get someone sentenced to death in the two countries are actually quite similar. In both North Korea and the United States, someone can be given the death penalty for treason and espionage. However, only in North Korea can you be sentenced to death for political dissidence, consumption of media that has not been approved by the government, and practicing a form of religion other than the state ideology of Juche. However, like in North Korea, someone can get the death penalty in the U.S. for murder, rape, and large-scale drug trafficking as well. Once someone has committed a crime punishable by death, both countries have different ways of going through the trial process. In North Korea, the government says everyone gets a trial where they can defend themselves in court. But by all accounts, it's just a charade. The trial is never fair, the verdict is most likely known going into the court, and that is even if someone's lucky enough to get to court. Oftentimes, the judiciary process is bypassed altogether, and the accused is just sent immediately to death row. In the United States, offenders are allowed to remain silent during the initial arrest and have a lawyer present during all future questioning. People in North Korea receive neither of these things. The defendant in the United States then gets a fair trial with an impartial jury, and the case is based on evidence. In an ideal situation, the defendant is innocent until proven guilty in the United States. However, in North Korea, if the government thinks you're guilty, you are guilty, no matter what. After being convicted and sent to death row in the United States, a defendant can still appeal their case, or a deal might even be made for a reduced sentence. This is to say, there are options for death row inmates, especially those whose punishment may not fit the crime. There are no appeals, no deals, and no hope to be had if someone finds himself on death row in North Korea. Due to lack of information coming out of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, we may never actually know how many people are executed there each year. However, from sources such as defectors and human rights organizations that are trying to make sense of the matter, we do have a few statistics. For example, Amnesty International reported there were around 105 executions between 2007 and 2012 in North Korea. From news sources such as Daily North Korea and Radio Free Asia, it's been reported that 2 men and a woman were publicly executed by firing squad in 2021 for distributing South Korean movies in the country. These statistics are just the tip of the iceberg, and many believe that hundreds of people are being sentenced to death each year by the North Korean government. There have been approximately 300 people from death row executed in the United States over the last decade. It's hard to tell whether this is more or less than North Korea, but the conditions in the prison camps where people on death row wait for executions in North Korea are something straight from a nightmare. In the United States, prisoners at least get the basics. They receive food and occasional recreational time depending on the prison and crime. Mental illness tends to run rampant on death row in the U.S., and the cells can be uncomfortable, but there are legal and civil rights organizations that fight for prisoners' well-being. There's no denying that the mental health of death row inmates in the U.S. could be taken a little more seriously, especially since the UN says more than 15 days in solitary confinement is torture. It's not uncommon for a death row inmate to spend much more than 15 days in solitary in the U.S. When sentenced to death row in North Korea, people are tortured, starved, and even murdered in the prison camps where they're held. These facilities aren't so much prisons as they are internment camps. It's sometimes referred to as a gulag system, reminiscent of the forced labor camps Joseph Stalin implemented in the Soviet Union. One of the main differences between people on death row in the two countries is that in North Korea, most prisoners don't even know what they're being detained for. There doesn't seem to be a distinction between petty criminals and those on death row in North Korea, as they're all sent to the same prison camps where they lose their basic human rights. In the United States, a prisoner cannot be sent to death row until after they are tried and found guilty. Within the North Korean prison camps themselves, death row inmates and everyone else are engaged in forced labor and torture. Routine executions and death from the conditions in the camps are reported to be common. So regardless of who you are or what you did, if you are in a North Korean prison camp, you are pretty much already on death row. In the United States, the execution of a death row inmate is planned well ahead of time. They know when they'll be put to death and are given a last meal. This doesn't mean waiting for your execution isn't scary, but at least the prisoner knows it's coming, and even what to expect, since the only means of execution currently in the US is lethal injection. In North Korea, a prisoner may not know what they are even being detained for, let alone what their sentence is or when it will be carried out. If you're unlucky enough to be on death row in North Korea, your execution could happen at any time and at any location. The main way death row prisoners are executed in North Korea seems to be by firing squad. That is, unless they die in the prison camp first. It has been reported that there are more gruesome ways that death row prisoners in North Korea have been executed. Depending on the crime, a firing squad might not be the method used. Prisoners could be hung or decapitated in public. These forms of execution seem to be reserved for high-ranking criminals such as officials convicted of drug trafficking or embezzlement, and those suspected of defecting or treason. The death penalty in the United States is a hot-button issue. Some are vehemently against it, while others support it. There are arguments to be made on both sides, and in the United States, people can have that debate. But what about in North Korea? Do the citizens of the country support the death penalty? Like most things in North Korea, it's hard to know. If you ask the government, North Koreans support everything they do, from working people to death in their prison camps to making sure their supreme leader lives a lavish lifestyle. But we all know this is just a show put on by the propaganda department of the country. What the people of North Korea believe or want is of no importance to the government. They are the ultimate authority, and anyone who disagrees with them may find themselves on death row. In 2019, the Transitional Justice Working Group, an NGO in South Korea, released a report that mapped out 318 sites where the North Korean government carried out public executions. In the United States, executions are no longer public and are carried out only in a handful of facilities. In North Korea, executions have taken place near rivers, markets, sports stadiums, and even schools. It's been suspected that during public executions in North Korea, family members and children are forced to watch their loved ones die. What it comes down to is that in North Korea, death row is somewhat of a free-for-all. There's not really a system in place other than if someone is believed to have committed a crime, they're found guilty without a real trial, sent to a prison camp to work and starve, and then publicly executed without any warning. In the United States, there's a process that leads to someone being sent to death row, and even this is becoming less and less prevalent over recent years. Military theorists have worked tirelessly on predicting who would win in certain war situations. One of the most popular setups these days is NATO versus Russia and China, along with Iran and North Korea. The problem is NATO also includes the United States, the most powerful military on Earth, with the rest of the combined forces of NATO a strong second. China would come in third if for no other reason than its massive army made up of more than 2 million men and women, and the growing size of its fleet. Russia is barely in this picture. Its economy has taken a huge tumble in the first year of its invasion of Ukraine, while its navy is bottled up in the Black Sea, and they've lost more than half of their pre-invasion tank total. The problem has gotten so bad that they're literally pulling 80-year-old relics out of museums and boneyards and then sending them to the front. At this point, Poland is actually preparing to build up its military to be on equal par with Russia. NATO also includes the countries of the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, Turkey, Spain, and now Finland, along with 24 other European countries. Meanwhile, Russia has seen its military fortune spiraling downward. As of November 2022, Russia has lost more than 200,000 soldiers, along with 160 generals and another 1,350 officers in just the first 9 months of the war, according to estimates by the U.S. Center for Naval Analysis. They've not been able to establish air superiority over Ukraine, a country 1/4 of its population, in part because of the continuing shipments of advanced weaponry from the US and NATO countries. Iran has been of limited help to Russia, insofar that they've been able to supply them with their Shahed 136 suicide drone systems. Unfortunately for Iran, it's been discovered that their drones contained Western-made parts that have somehow escaped the sanctions imposed on Russia. Once these transactions were made known, the Western companies involved have apparently tightened their overseas shipments. Unless Iran can begin to reproduce such advanced and miniaturized technical components, their stockpile of drones will dwindle and not be replaced. North Korea is far down the list of useful allies. Their military, while strong in numbers, over 1.28 million soldiers, is extremely backwards and has barely advanced beyond its 1960s technology. They've been making efforts to improve their nuclear weapon missile program, but for this scenario, those weapons are off the table. Of course, any war between such great powers would have to exclude nuclear weapons. No one will win if city-killing nuclear weapons were tossed about. As few as 50 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons hitting cities anywhere on the globe would cause enough soot and other pollution in the skies that the planet would suffer climactic effects unprecedented in human history and could start what's known as a nuclear winter. In that scenario, harvests would fail, mass starvation would follow, and the world economy and technological society as we know it would crumble within weeks. Hopefully all the powers involved are aware of this and would refrain from making such a bad choice as to resort to nukes, even tactical ones. The question is there a situation under which NATO could be defeated by the combined efforts of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea? Well, yes, but it would require a very unique set of situations with very precise elements that would be unlikely, perhaps nearly impossible, to occur all at the same time in the real world. But there is a possibility. So, let's set up the parameters under which NATO could lose. The ABCs for a NATO loss. We should state from the beginning that there is no way NATO would lose to what we will now call the Iron Coalition, with the United States and its military forces still involved. There would have to be a way to separate the US from its NATO allies, both militarily and economically. There are 3 scenarios that could make this a reasonable possibility. Part 1. When the levee breaks. First, China and Russia could use electromagnetic pulse weapons or EMPs to take down the US electrical grid, as well as some of the US's overseas bases. There are debates about just how effective such an attack could be, and whether the US could knock down any missiles headed their way before they reach the proper altitude and location for them to explode. It is known, however, that both China and Russia have put an effort into making improved or advanced EMP weapons, ones that have thinner casing around the nuclear explosive material, thus releasing more of the gamma radiation that would cause the EMP pulse itself. We also know that China has already practiced sending balloons over the US, one of which, that we know of, in 2023 sailed across the entire continental US before being shot down off the East Coast. It's not impossible that China could miniaturize a small enough nuke that it would be transportable over the US by such a large balloon, and which might evade US radar or simply be ignored by NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, as just another weather balloon. Or if China was sufficiently motivated, they could marry one of their state-of-the-art hypersonic missiles with an advanced EMP weapon, making for a first-strike capability that the US would be hard-pressed to stop. If such a weapon, or multiple weapons, were detonated over the US, the resulting turmoil and confusion might prohibit the US from reacting quickly enough against any attack in Europe. These EMP pulses would not create any physical damage on the ground, but they could overload all the power grids in the US, together with most electronic technologies, from computers and cars to smartphones, that our daily lives depend on. The perceived threat that a second attack might follow, one in which more lethal nuclear weapons would be used against US cities, might be enough to make the US think twice about involving themselves in an overseas war. Again, this is a highly unlikely situation and totally speculative, but something like this would have to happen in order to drive a wedge between the US and the other NATO countries. There's also a strong possibility that such an attack would include Canada as well, knocking them out of the alliance too. Part 2. Just click this link. The second part of such a plan would involve extensive cyber warfare. 3 of the members of the Iron Coalition are known to harbor sophisticated hacking organizations, believed in each case to be actively supported by their respective government. China has 3 very active groups named Red Gulf, APT-41, and Barium, whose activities are so closely overlapped that some experts believe they might all be part of a larger coordinated government operation. 2 of the groups, Red Gulf and APT-41, have proved to be using a version of the Keyplug backdoor malware program in addition to several other malicious software tools. These known groups have already hacked into at least 6 US state government websites, as well as hundreds of corporate and industrial organizations. Russia has its own rogue gallery of state-sponsored hacking groups. On May 9, 2023, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, CISA, and its Western partners released a joint advisory for a sophisticated cyber espionage tool used by Russian cyber groups called the Snake malware program. This is just the latest hacking effort that Russia has covertly supported in order to attack US and Western countries' businesses, government-connected sites, and industrial elements. CISA has stated that the Snake program has infected everything from COVID-19 research, election organizations and government websites, to healthcare and pharmaceutical companies, defense industries, energy companies, nuclear and commercial power facilities, water controls, aviation coordination, and even video game manufacturers. These attacks are only the latest in a wave of what has been decades of such attacks directed from Russia. Before Snake, the same coordinated family of Russian-backed hackers were blamed for a number of high-profile malicious cyber attacks, including the compromise of the SolarWinds software supply chain in 2020, the targeting of companies developing COVID-19 vaccines, also in 2020, attacks on the U.S. industrial control system infrastructure in 2018, the worldwide NotPetya ransomware attacks in 2017, and the leaks of stolen documents from the Democratic National Committee website prior to the 2016 presidential election. Not to be outdone by its 2 bigger brothers in cybercrime, North Korea has also supported its fair share of malicious software attacks. One group, known as the Lazarus Group, reportedly stole $100 million in cryptocurrency in June 2022. They were later caught laundering $60 million of that in January 2023. The Lazarus Group has been closely associated with the interests of North Korea for many years. Their most well-known attack was a cyber theft of $81 million from the Bank of Bangladesh in 2016. And who can forget the cyber attack on Sony Pictures in 2014 by a group that called themselves the Guardians of Peace? This was in direct response to Sony's release of a very unflattering comedy about a plot to assassinate North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. It's not inconceivable that these three countries could unite their various state-sponsored hacking and cybercrime organizations into a massive worldwide effort, something along the lines of the notorious 1930s organized crime group Murder Incorporated. Only this group would be known as Cyber Warfare Incorporated, and their crime would not be killing people but killing infrastructure. Such a group could target nationwide electrical grids, online power stations, airports and shipping facilities, government offices, hospitals and rail networks, even the internet itself. Since we're discussing what is basically a worst-case scenario, we could anticipate a massive cyber attack just before the EMP attack. The cybercriminals could severely degrade the ability for the US or any NATO country for that matter to coordinate its military, as well as hampering any recovery from the follow-on EMP pulse. While most military hardware would be protected against the effects of some parts of the EMP wave, government and military infrastructure have proved to be far more vulnerable to cyber attacks. In 2008, for example, a single thumb drive incautiously plugged into a laptop at a US base in the Middle East caused the biggest invasion of US Department of Defense networks ever seen. It took the DoD more than 14 months to remove the virus, codenamed Agent.btz, from more than 300,000 computer systems. This attack led the Pentagon to create its own coordinated defense against future attacks, and thus the US Cyber Command was born. But as that incident points out, humans are imperfect, even ones in the military. There are hundreds of ways to infect computers these days, from simple thumb drives to elaborate phishing attempts, even bribery and blackmail. For example, as recently as November 2022, the United Arab Emirates, supposedly an ally of the US, hired 3 former US intelligence and military officials to help the UAE government break into computer networks in the US and elsewhere. EMP attacks that knock out anything electrical that's unprotected, cyber attacks that invade every computer and network. What else could cause the US to sit out in a war against NATO? Part 3. America first means everyone else is on their own. This is Part 3, when a US political group decides to keep America out of the war. Both political parties in the US have claimed that leaders in the other party are working hand-in-hand with foreign governments. While we won't get into a deep political discussion here, we must remember that the US has, from time to time, been reluctant to get into foreign wars, especially those in Europe. In World War I, a large percentage of Americans felt that Europe should stick to its own affairs and that the US should remain neutral. Woodrow Wilson ran for president in 1916 with the policy he dubbed the America First ideal, promising to keep the US out of World War I. Known then as the Great War. There was a similar but even stronger anti-war movement launched in 1940, just a year before the US was forcibly drawn into World War II by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This movement, led by US celebrities like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, was organized under the banner of the America First Committee. This may have been the strongest anti-war organization in US history, with a peak membership base close to 850,000. In fact, it's been suggested that had Japan not attacked, the US's commitment to help Great Britain might have come too late, allowing Nazi Germany to defeat them, which would allow it to turn its entire focus on defeating the Soviet Union. It's not inconceivable, then, that a US government might take a similar non-interventionist stance in the future, especially if they were threatened with nuclear weapons or if they had their hands full in dealing with the 1-2 punch of cyber attacks and EMP damage. The US government might even think they were doing the right thing, hoping that NATO and the Iron Coalition would fight themselves to a draw, while the US licked its electronic and cyber wounds and prepared for the world post-World War III. Comparing the forces involved. This is all necessary for the Iron Coalition to consider a war against NATO, that somehow China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea would keep the US out of any hostilities. If that unique situation could be engineered, what else would the Iron Coalition need to be able to successfully engage NATO? First off, none of these 4 countries currently have the capability to transport enough troops to the European theater to even begin considering a land invasion. The 29 NATO member nations contain roughly 600 million people, excluding the US and Canada's 365 million. And while without the US, NATO is still a sizable military force, the US alone accounts for 1.3 million of the 3.5 million total NATO armed forces, or more than 35% of its possible strength. Yet, without its larger ally, NATO is considered a very advanced military force, in part due to its high-tech weaponry. The 29 remaining countries' combined navies operate 9 large aircraft carriers, while Russia has only one, the Admiral Kuznetsov, perpetually in dry dock for repairs, while China has 3, one of which is a training-only carrier with a 4th under construction. NATO's combined fighter aircraft total around 6,000, though they'd be missing the massive potential of the US's 13,000 fighter aircraft. But NATO employs many of the same 5th-generation fighter aircraft as the US, including the F-35 and F-15EX, as well as a similar 4th-generation aircraft of European manufacture like the French Rafale and the Eurofighter Typhoon. Meanwhile, Russia's Air Force has, to be honest, seen better days, so has their tank corps. Their navy is also in shambles. But what was Russia's military really designed to do? Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, their military has degraded year by year. There's no longer a threat to the West. Russia's military is currently designed almost exclusively to combat threats along its own border. They have occasionally sent some of their best equipment to foreign wars in Syria, but even then their equipment did not function as well as they'd hoped. And when pitted against Western forces, their ground troops also failed. In the only actual combat between US forces and Russian regulars, the 2018 Battle of Qashm in Syria, a handful of US Marines and Army Special Forces, together with a small group of Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) fighters, were attacked by a group of some 250 mixed Russian Wagner mercenaries and Syrian pro-government militia who were attempting to cross the Euphrates southwest of Qashm. U.S. forces fired a few artillery rounds to warn them off, and they initially pulled back. But later in the evening, around 10 p.m., the U.S. troops were surprised to detect a column of Russian T-72 tanks and support vehicles, along with as many as 500 soldiers heading toward their position from the east side of the Euphrates. The U.S. troops called in massive air and artillery support, involving fighter jets, bombers, gunships, attack helicopters, and drones, in addition to howitzer artillery and HIMARS rockets. The Russian and Syrian forces never got within rifle range of their U.S. targets. 4 hours later, when the fighting was over, more than 100 of the attacking forces had been killed, though some Russian estimates put the losses at more than 300. The only casualties on the US SDF side was a single wounded SDF soldier. The only way Russian troops can be expected to successfully attack NATO countries is with massive help from the much more numerous and frankly at this point better supplied Chinese Army, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, and their Air Force, the PLA-AF. But how would China manage to get enough of their ground and air forces to western Russia in order to launch a ground attack against Poland, Germany, France, and Italy to make a difference? The little engine that could. Maybe. Possibly. Again, we must take liberties with reality. Russia has long desired to improve cross-border cooperation with China. The April 2023 meeting between Presidents Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were expected to culminate in an agreement to improve the cooperation between the two countries via new pipelines and potentially an improved rail network. Though this agreement never materialized, it's not out of the realm of possibility. China has invested billions into a continent-spanning program called the Belt and Road Program, designed to link together multiple nations with oil and mineral reserves that China needs in order to power its economy, which is heavily dependent on imports from overseas. Forget for the moment that the Belt and Road Program is heavily in debt, more than $1 trillion worth, and is on the brink of bankruptcy in many of the countries where its projects have been funded. Instead, let's paint a best-case scenario. Let's assume instead that many of the countries that China has linked began to repay their loans, and China has the funds and inclination to increase its rail network all the way up to the Trans-Siberian Railway. With that infrastructure in place and a healthy building program to create hundreds, if not thousands of rail cars, China could begin shipping troops and some equipment on what would be a 7 to 8 day journey from the Far East to Moscow. From there, a simple 1 or 2 days further rail transit would bring them to the border of Poland, or even further west into Russia's few remaining vassal states, Belarus. It is even conceivable that some of North Korea's massive army could also hitch a ride on this vast little engine that could rail network while they still use Korean War-era tanks, and their air force is not really worthy of that name. They do have more than 6,000 pieces of artillery to supplement their 1.28 million-man army. China could add its more than 3,700 tanks and 4,500 artillery pieces as well. As Soviet leader Stalin once reportedly said, quantity has a quality all its own. While we're stretching the limits of what might be possible by imagining such massive transfers of men and machines across the longest rail line in the world, there are 3 points that must be stressed. First, while these plans may seem impossible, they are completely doable given enough time and money and determination. Second, there would be no way to hide such a buildup from today's world of satellite and global reconnaissance. Third, and most importantly, even if NATO detected these transfers, there's not a thing NATO could do about it. NATO is first and foremost a defensive organization. They couldn't strike first if they wanted to, and they're made up of 29 separate countries, not including the US and Canada, with 29 different governments and 29 different countries that they'd then have to answer to. We've seen how little good it did to know Putin was massing an invading army on the borders of Ukraine. Until Russia actually invaded, there wasn't anything Ukraine or anyone else could do except to prepare for such a massive attack. Taking to the skies. To oppose NATO's US-less air force of some 6,000 fixed-wing aircraft, China could bring in more than 3,000 of their own combat aircraft to supplement Russia's 3,800. But while Russia's air force is losing numbers and often being shown as ineffective against Ukraine's air defense systems, China's air force is growing. They recently began deploying their competitor to the 5th-gen F-35, the Chengdu J-20, and China is also trying to compete with the US's planned 6th-gen aircraft with their own prototype, which looks so much like the US Next Generation Air Dominance Fighter or NGAD that some analysts have called it a copycat. China has been known to use its vast networks of hackers to steal designs from US defense industries without robust security protocols on their networks. They've also back-engineered almost every Russian high-tech system they've ever bought, from the S-400 missile system to the frontline Su-35 fighter. It's not unlikely then that China's attempting to do the same with both the F-22 and the NGAD prototypes. A very real deficit. One lesson learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, however, is that no airspace is safe when the soldiers below are using man-portable air defense systems or manpads, like the Stinger missile, or in the case of tanks and armored personnel carriers, within range of javelins or other anti-tank missile systems. While it's clear that Russia has struggled against such a hostile environment, again, they've lost nearly half their pre-invasion force of 4,000 main battle tanks, let's make another assumption that isn't far from the mark. In the beginning of 2023, the United States had sent nearly 7,000 javelins to Ukraine, more than a third of its entire stockpile. While the US has orders to purchase another 1,800 to help replenish those stockpiles, it's noticeable the rate these weapons are being used far outweighs the ability for the weapons manufacturers to create new ones. The same has been found with artillery shells and missiles. Both Ukraine and Russia are going through their existing stockpiles at an alarming rate. By May 2023, the leader of the Wagner private military company, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was complaining bitterly and publicly that they were only receiving a tenth of the promised artillery shells they felt they needed. Meanwhile, reports from January 2023 suggest Russia may run out of missiles as early as the end of May. Indeed, Russia's ferocious bombardment of Ukrainian cities by their missiles and long-range rockets slowed appreciably in April. But what if China turned its vast manufacturing empire toward the mass production of these systems? Could China produce 2,000 to 3,000 javelins or Stingers per month? They could certainly outproduce what the NATO countries are currently producing. And if, in our best possible reality for the Iron Coalition scenario, the US chose to stay out of any attack on NATO, then the vast supplies of US-made anti-tank missiles and manpad systems would not be available to them. The same would be true of artillery shells. North Korea and Iran are already supplying artillery shells to Russia, at least 300,000 in the case of Iran, and as many as 1 million shells from North Korea, though that number is in dispute. It's conceivable then that such transfers of material support would not only continue but would increase. The sad but inescapable results. When we add all this together, here's what we have. NATO standing alone, devoid of its largest and most powerful member country, the United States. China, Russia, and North Korea, with the largest combined hacking network ever seen, able to take down most government, industrial, and infrastructure websites. China and Russia's willingness to use EMP weapons to keep the US at arm's length and possibly against Europe as well. An interconnected railway system between Russia and China that allows for an expedited movement of overwhelming numbers of Chinese and North Korean troops and military hardware to the eastern borders of NATO. China and Iran, and possibly North Korea, using their combined industrial might to supply all the artillery shells, drones, and missiles and rockets that a massive assault against NATO would require. The bottom line is, with all these elements in place, it would be nearly impossible for the Iron Coalition to lose. After such a massive force crashes into Poland, rolls across many of the smaller nations like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and into Germany, and then positions itself to strike deep into the Balkan states, with Italy and France next, it's likely that individual nations will begin to make hurried and separate peace agreements with China and Russia, possibly leaving the United Kingdom to fight on alone, until the barrage of missiles devastates their navy so badly they surrender on somewhat agreeable terms. This is not a pleasant scenario, and while it's highly unlikely, there is a non-zero possibility that this could happen. Nothing that we've described here is impossible. The time frame might take years, the coordination might require huge compromises on the part of the four attacking nations, and almost everything possible would have to go right for the Iron Coalition to succeed. The sun will come out. But this is very unlikely to happen, to say the least. It's clear to most economic observers that China, despite an unprecedented increase of improving and expanding much of its military, especially its navy and rocket forces, has hopes of trying to control the world's economies politically and semi-peacefully. Its leaders also know that their own country's future is balanced on a knife's edge. They import up to 70% of their oil and gas from overseas, and more than 70% of their food, as well as the raw materials that make up the fertilizer they need for the food they do produce themselves. It is abundantly clear that if China launches a war, any war, even one with a goal as small as retaking Taiwan, the world's markets will shut their doors to them, and their economy will simply grind to a halt. Within 3 months, they won't have enough fuel for their trucks and cars, and 3 months after that, a famine will set in that will be catastrophic in its lethality. Another ray of hope is that relations between China and Russia are far from cordial. Despite Xi visiting Moscow, he left without making any concrete agreements in support of Russia. Xi has also been very reluctant to send lethal aid to Russia in fear of the surprisingly strong sanctions put in place against Russia. He knows the same thing will happen if China invades Taiwan. So in a strange sense, the invasion of Ukraine and the universally strong response from nearly all of the NATO and EU members has perhaps reduced the likelihood of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The sanctions against Russia have shown that any overt military actions that China makes would be catastrophic for its future, both politically and economically. For now, the possibility of an iron coalition between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea against NATO will thankfully remain a simple exercise, a what-if scenario, with about as much chance of coming to fruition as Vladimir Putin has of sprouting a halo. Kim Jong-un is preparing North Korea for war, and that war is going to happen sooner rather than later. That's the message delivered by 38 North, a publication from the Stimson Center that specializes in North Korean affairs, as it says that the situation in the Korean Peninsula is more dangerous now than it's been at any time since 1950. The publication goes further. Like his grandfather before in 1950, Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to go to war. But will North Korea really start a war in 2024? To find the answer, we need to dig into what Kim Jong-un has been saying in recent months, and more tellingly what he's been doing. Let's start with the rhetoric. On January 18, 2024, the RAND Corporation, or RAND, published an article that highlighted 2023 claims by South Korea's National Intelligence Service that North Korea was likely to start using unexpected cyber and military provocations in 2024. The news was just the latest that suggests that Kim Jong-un is gearing up for conflict, and the words coming out of the leader's mouth seem to align with the theory. Take what he said at the end of 2023 as an example. During the course of 5 days of year-end meetings with his allies, Kim claimed that the United States poses various types of military threat, wrapping up on the final day of meetings by telling his military that it needs to maintain an overwhelming war response capability. As is usually the case, Kim is placing all the blame on North Korea's enemies, though his message indicates that he believes that war could break out in the Korean Peninsula at any time. While he claims an invasion would force that to happen, the greater likelihood is that he's going to be the one who starts the fight. But hold on a second. Yes, the claim that Pyongyang needs to be ready for war at any time is a serious one, but is it really much different from the claims that Kim has made before? After all, this is a man known for his constant provocations, both of the US and South Korea, and so these comments could just be more of a series of seemingly empty threats. That seems unlikely to be the case. Honing in on Kim's provocations, there's no denying that they've both grown more frequent and more dangerous over the last decade or so. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, breaks it all down into numbers. This data reveals that provocations from North Korea have increased dramatically since the presidency of George W. Bush. When Bush was in office, North Korea made an average of 3.5 provocations per year. That ramped up to 10.88 per year when Barack Obama was in office and stayed somewhat stable during Donald Trump's presidency, declining only slightly to 10.25 per year. Then Joe Biden took office and Kim Jong-un seemed to grow bolder. CSIS said the United States has recorded an average of 30.33 provocations per year since Biden was elected, around triple what they were during the previous 2 administrations, creating a total of 91 North Korean provocations during Biden's tenure in office. These provocations don't solely come in the form of rhetoric. CSIS says that North Korea has been ramping up its missile testing, with each test launch being a provocation, and many of its tests aren't related to experimental equipment. Kim is testing weapons that he already has to make sure that they're combat-ready when the time comes. Something has changed in Kim's approach to war. According to DW, that change is linked to the abandonment of North Korea's approach to the United States. Over the last few years, Pyongyang has looked to normalize relationships with the US as best it could. However, according to DW, Kim may now believe that such normalization is impossible. It claims that many analysts are underestimating just how important this desire for normalization was in terms of Kim not turning his threats of war into action. With that guardrail removed, there's now very little stopping him from following through on all of the talk and actually launching an attack. We can trace this change of internal policy to 2019 and the Hanoi summit between Kim and then US President Donald Trump. At that time, the talk focused on North Korea winding down its weapons program in return for the US waiving some of the sanctions it had placed on Pyongyang. But 5 years later, that promise of fewer sanctions has not panned out, with Kim now supposedly believing that North Korea has two options when it comes to the US: live under the thumb of a supposed oppressor, or as DW puts it, take advantage of the supposed fact that the time is ripe for the status quo to be challenged. We can see this change of approach most clearly when we look beyond the US and check how Kim Jong-un is talking about his neighbor, South Korea. In the 2023 year-end speech that Kim gave to the North Korean people, he made several promises. Beyond outlining some of the country's military plans for 2024, he touched on inter-Korean relationships, and his tone was hostile. The conversation reports that Kim said that the relationship between the two has become a relationship between two hostile countries and two belligerents at war. The rhetoric became even more aggressive. Kim went on to say that he now believed the Republic of Korea clan to be Pyongyang's biggest enemy, calling for North Korea to continue stockpiling weapons to ensure it had the overwhelming power to defeat its southern nemesis. Forbes also has snippets of Kim's speeches in which he declares South Korea a hostile state, and most worryingly, that he would not hesitate to use nuclear weapons if, quote, the enemies ignite a war. Reuters also reported that Kim told his military that it needs to be ready to pacify the entire territory of South Korea, again mentioning the use of nuclear bombs as a response to any attack the South makes. Kim making threats to South Korea isn't anything new, but the nature of these threats, especially the reclassification of South Korea as a hostile state, is something that we've not seen before. Kim is following his normal route in propaganda terms of blaming enemies of North Korea for escalating conflict. But now he's saying that those supposed escalations will be met with force, all suggesting that he's gearing up for a war in 2024. But again, you could argue that those are just words, the ramblings of a madman whose bark is far worse than his bite. The real proof that North Korea will go to war in 2024 comes from Kim's actions rather than what he says in an attempt to ensure his oppressed people stay loyal to him and his causes. Kim's actions suggest that war is practically inevitable. For all of his posturing, giving up on the concept of reunification with South Korea means that Kim has said no to any potentially peaceful resolution of the conflict that exists between them. Instead, he's looking to claim South Korea through force, and what he's doing on the military front supports that claim. Take his new satellites and drones as an example. During the previously mentioned end-of-year speech, Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea will be launching 3 new satellites in 2024. The announcement comes in the wake of Pyongyang finally managing to get a spy satellite into space in November 2023, with that launch achieving success at the 3rd time of asking, following 2 failed launches. What this proves is that North Korea now has the technology to launch the satellites that Kim wants to build, and if he gets 3 more in orbit during 2024, Kim will have the ability to spy on South Korea and potentially the US in ways he hasn't been able to do before. The November launch was controversial enough. The US condemned it for being in brazen violation of UN resolutions intended to govern such launches, so Kim has shown that he doesn't care about following international laws and resolutions. Add to all of this Kim's promise to start building military drones. Again, Pyongyang could argue that this action is simply an attempt to achieve parity with the US and South Korea, both of which have access to drones. But when taken along with the rhetoric, remember, Kim is blaming provocation from the US and South Korea for these policies, the picture becomes clearer. Kim would have his people believe that the supposed provocations from North Korea's enemies are going to force his hand. With every move he makes from now until conflict begins, merely being preparation so Pyongyang can defend itself. And there's much more. North Korea's missile tests have been intensifying over the last year, with the country also supposedly developing new types of missiles that would allow it to pose even a greater threat to its enemies. According to DW, 2023 saw Pyongyang launch a record number of missiles, a clear show of strength directed at South Korea, along with a rocket from November that put its satellite into space. Worse yet, Kim claims that one of the missiles it launched is an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that would allow it to hit targets much further afield than any missile it used previously. ICBMs often carry nuclear warheads. Though North Korea's testing of this type of technology isn't confirmed, a successful ICBM test would mean that Kim has the missiles he needs to drop a nuke on South Korea without his army ever having to leave the north. That is a worrying prospect, and it feeds into the nuclear rhetoric that Kim's been spouting since the end of 2023. Just as worrying are the reports coming of the country's first missile test of 2024. On January 15th, CBS reported that North Korea claimed it had conducted its first successful flight test of a solid-fuel missile equipped with a hypersonic warhead. The launch was detected by both the Japanese and South Korean militaries, with the mention of a hypersonic warhead being especially troublesome. The Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation says that anything that can travel at hypersonic speeds is capable of Mach 5 or higher, at least 5 times the speed of sound. While ballistic missiles have long been capable of hitting these types of speeds, the fact that North Korea is apparently now capable of launching Mach 5 rockets is huge. After all, the faster a missile can move, the harder it is to both detect and hit it when it's in motion. Plus, faster rockets result in less time to shoot the missile out of the sky. Regardless, the missile traveled about 621 miles before landing in the East Sea, with Japan's defense ministry stating it had reached a maximum altitude of 30 miles. It's also not the first North Korean missile to splash down in the East Sea in recent times. A Hwasong-18 ICBM fired from Pyongyang did the same on December 18, 2023. All of this amounts to Kim Jong-un showing the world that North Korea has missiles that are capable of hitting South Korea. Those missiles may not have the precise capabilities that he claims. We can rarely tell between propaganda and truth when it comes to Kim's rhetoric. But Pyongyang's rockets clearly work well enough to launch satellites and reach some of Kim's most feared enemies. With capable missiles now a part of his military, Kim's able to back something up that he's offered many times in the past: his nuclear threats. Reuters reported that North Korea hasn't tested a nuclear weapon since 2017, the same year that it was able to successfully launch an ICBM. That successful test came with typical bluster from Kim Jong-un, who directed his threats at Japan by claiming that his new missiles could sink Japan into the sea. However, nothing came of these threats. That isn't because North Korea has abandoned its nuclear program. North Korea has abandoned its that Kim has likely been slowly building up his stockpile in the years that followed the successful 2017 test. It points to data from the Institute for Science and International Study, which says that Pyongyang may have had anywhere between 31 and 96 nukes in April 2023. It may have built more in the months since, and Kim hasn't been shy about his nuclear ambitions. In 2021, he claimed that North Korea had created technology that allows it to miniaturize and lighten its standard nuclear weapons, making them easier to launch, and potentially meaning Pyongyang's ICBMs could carry their nuclear payloads even further. Plus, January 2023 brought with it clear claims from Kim that he aimed to exponentially expand North Korea's nuclear arsenal, building up to it having the ability to mass-produce tactical warheads. All extremely worrying stuff. However, concern could evolve into fear when we consider the fact that nuclear terrorists on the Korean peninsula have worsened since the beginning of 2023. Back then, Kim's claims of expansion could have been seen as posturing, like so much of what he says. But the fact that he's directly mentioned that North Korea would respond to any aggression from South Korea with a nuclear strike. Every recent missile launch has been a threat of a nuclear strike. So too has every claim about the expansion and modernization of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. It all leads to a tense situation. And it's a situation that the United States may be unintentionally feeding. According to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, the U.S. is committed to using nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea should any country launch nukes against it. That was cause enough for tension on its own. You could argue that North Korea's entire nuclear program even emerged as a response to this indirect threat. And even though the U.S. would be unlikely to ever launch nukes unless it was a retaliatory strike, Think of it as a self-fulfilling prophecy. North Korea is so threatened by the US and its nukes that it developed nuclear weapons of its own, thus intensifying that threat. Tensions deepened even more when South Korea and the US announced that they plan to cooperate to form a plan for nuclear weapons use. ICANN says that declaration came in April 2023, deepening the cooperation that already exists between the US and South Korea as a part of their Indo-Pacific Trilateral Military Agreement, which also includes Japan, to cooperate militaristically. On the one hand, the agreement saw South Korea's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, reaffirm that his country wouldn't make any efforts to develop its own nuclear weapons despite international pressure to do so in the face of North Korea's threats. But it's also in this agreement that the US confirmed that it would issue a swift, overwhelming, and decisive response to any nuclear launch by North Korea. Kim Jong-un likely took this as a direct threat. His increasingly aggressive rhetoric seems to suggest he did, along with his reframing of South Korea as a hostile nation, rather than one with which he aims to achieve reunification. Perhaps Kim sees the combined threat of South Korea and the US, with Japan backing them up, as so great that he'll have no choice but to push the nuclear button, regardless of what the US claims it would do in response. There's also one little change in vernacular that could lend credence to the idea that Kim is more willing to use nuclear weapons. When Pyongyang launched its ICBM into the East Sea in December 2023, it called the test a launch drill. Every reference to similar launches in months and years prior have always been referred to as test firings. The switch to launch drill may seem minor, but it could confirm that Pyongyang has perfected its Hwasong-18 ICBM and is now ready to move into mass production rather than building individual rockets to see if they'll work. Only time will tell. But if we put it all together, the picture does not look pretty. Kim is making increasingly aggressive threats against his, quote, enemies, as well as putting his military on notice. He's made a direct reference to conducting nuclear strikes, with his missile tests proving he is likely capable of doing so. The launch of 3 new spy satellites in 2024 will enable him to conduct reconnaissance on South Korea in ways that he previously couldn't. Worse yet, there's more evidence that Kim is gearing up for something big. DW reports that US satellites have recently tracked changes to a chemical production base called Manfo Una Chemical Complex. The base, which is believed to be used to create the chemicals needed to fuel North Korea's missiles, as well as chemicals that go into its nuclear weapons, has been undergoing extensive expansion and modernization in recent years. 38 North has more news. It says that the satellite images, all of which come from commercial satellites, have shown increased activity at the plant since April 4, 2021, suggesting a ramping up of Kim's nuclear arsenal. This tallies with what Kim himself says, and with the Reuters article that claims that he may have nearly 100 nuclear weapons in his arsenal. The 38 North article goes on to say that the satellite imagery has tracked multiple instances of special rail cars moving between the Una base and North Korea's Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center, the place responsible for most of the country's nukes. Those rail cars are believed to carry chemical reagents, specifically nitric and sulfuric acid, that are used to convert, enrich, and process the materials used in nuclear bombs. In short, there's a clear link between a chemical plant that's being modernized and Pyongyang's chief nuclear research center. As for the modernization efforts, 38 North says that the facility now has 5 production plants, all stationed alongside a single specialized railway that runs through the facility and connects 2 others. Imagery captured in 2016 showed the implementation of several settling tanks for chemicals, though later images showed those tanks to be empty, raising questions about whether they're operational. However, most eyes should be focused on one of the facility's southern production plants. Made up of 2 large buildings, this plant has seen the addition of a pair of vertical storage tanks since 2018, along with consistent renovations and the building of the foundation of a new storage building, which looks likely to measure 12 by 90 meters. All of this activity tells us that the plant is up and running and that it's supplying chemicals to help the North Korean war effort. These are also not the only expansions occurring. On January 25th, 38 North also reported on the construction of a new wharf, this time at a petrochemical facility located in Nampo. That port is North Korea's largest, and it connects to the Taedong River to provide easy access to China and the rest of Southeast Asia. New storage tanks have been added, with 38 North suggesting that the work indicates that North Korea expects to start importing more petroleum, lubricants, and oils, all materials used in weapons, in the coming months. These are just 2 isolated examples of the modernization that appear to be happening in North Korea. Taken alone, They might mean little, but in the wake of Kim's nuclear threats, the expansion of the chemical plant that directly links Pyongyang's nuclear research takes on a whole new meaning. And building a new wharf in Nampo suggests that increased trade between North Korea and China is expected to take place. And that brings us to our ultimate sign that North Korea is gearing up for a war in 2024. It's strengthening its alliances. In December 2023, the South China Morning Post reported that a senior North Korean diplomat visited Beijing. The visit was notable because it was the first made to China since before the COVID-19 pandemic, with the media outlet reporting that the meeting could have been a way for China to sue North Korea as a way to put pressure on the US. That may have been the case, but it's also worth noting that the meeting could represent the defrosting of some tensions that have built between North Korea and China in recent years, especially given that China is now more open to deporting North Korean escapees. Plus, on January 25th, The Independent reported that North Korea was preparing to host a Chinese delegation led by China's vice foreign minister, again with the likely goal of strengthening bonds between Pyongyang and Beijing. An alliance like this could give Kim the confidence he needs to launch a strike against South Korea, especially if China offers its military backing. It's also not the only partnership North Korea is cultivating. On January 24th, VOA News reported that the alliance between North Korea and Russia was reaching previously unheard-of levels. It reported on Pranay Vadi, the Senior Director of Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the National Security Council, who gave a chilling speech to the Center for Strategic and International Studies on January 18th. Vadi said, "What we are seeing between Russia and North Korea is an unprecedented level of cooperation in the military sphere." VOA's reports highlight that Putin turned to Kim when he needed to replenish Moscow's weapons stockpile after the Ukraine invasion took longer than Putin anticipated. Kim obliged, and in doing so, he built a bond with Russia that goes beyond mere trade. Satellite images released in October 2023 showed about 1,000 containers shipping from North Korea to Russia, all in violation of sanctions against Moscow that likely contained weapons. The New York Times reported that North Korean artillery has started to show up in Ukraine, confirming the military alliance. Kim is helping Russia in this way because he knows he'll be able to go running to Putin when he decides to start his own war. He wants to see the situation in Ukraine resolved in Russia's favor, so that he'll have another major power in his corner when he eventually decides to attack. For as much as many analysts see Kim and perhaps even North Korea as a whole a big joke, it's clear that the great successor has been gearing up for something big. He's forging alliances with the world's two strongest military powers after the United States. He has nuclear weapons and has built the missiles to launch them. North Korea is engaging in the modernization and expansion of crucial bases, and it's now able to launch spy satellites into space. All of this has been achieved amidst recent rhetoric that shows that Kim Jong-un isn't in the mood for normalization or reunification anymore. He's ready for war, and at some point in 2024 he's going to have moved all of his chess pieces into place, meaning he'll be ready to strike. Now check out North Korea's plans for offensive war, or watch this video instead.